Hello there, everyone. I am the Sea Monster, and I send this message to you all. Welcome to my essay video on Transformers Dark of the Moon. Directed by the man, the myth, the legend, the king of boom himself, Michael Bay, Dark of the Moon is the third installment in what is often referred to as the Bayverse. Basically, it's movie 3 in a series of 5, since Bumblebee and Rise of the Beasts are in a continuity of their own, and Transformers 1 is also in one of its own, despite how producer Lorenzo Di Bonaventura may try and fail miserably to convince you otherwise. Now, typically I cover monster media, or at least monster-adjacent media. Sea Monster Essays is kind of the name of the game here. But considering we're about to discuss a film about autonomous robotic organisms from space that are big enough to turn into cars, jets, trucks, etc., and since it can also be described as an alien invasion film, something which certain media like the Godzilla franchise is no stranger to, an argument could be made that it'd be strange if I didn't talk about the Transformers franchise in some capacity. In fact, I actually have. On a few streams no less, but not a full-blown essay video on anything Transformers related whatsoever. Until now. The Bayformers series is often cited as being one of the quintessential examples of style over substance, a series of films with little to no story or character writing to speak of or is worth of note, and just exists solely to make money while putting on loud, extravagant fireworks shows in order to distract audiences from even thinking about anything in said films beyond the spectacle. And let me just say that I do kinda get it. Michael Bay does indulge in the notion of having something happen in a film for the sake of how cool it would be, or for the sake of a cool shot in the majority of his filmography. Heck, the over-the-top nature of his visual style is all part of the appeal in his films to begin with, like the Bad Boys films, as an example. However, I'd like for us to broaden our minds a bit, and actually look into why a certain film works or doesn't, as opposed to just saying, it's dumb, it's stupid, it makes no sense, there's no point in analyzing it. I am absolutely against that kind of dogma simply dismissing this film, or any film for that matter, from being given its day in court for its overall quality to be more thoroughly determined, in the same vein as how I'm against the notion that we should just turn our brains off or to leave our brains at the door when we watch it, because any film in existence, any work of art should be given a fair and due process without those who are analyzing it to be told not to critique it so hard, or that's not worth critiquing at all.
First of all, I love you people out there, boy. Y'all are rich, man. Y'all come to me talking about, well, hey, man, what did you want? Just, leave your brain at the door and just go in and have a good time. No, I'm not gonna cut my fucking brain off. I'm gonna leave my brain on, leave it intact, and watch everything carefully and tell you how much of a piece of shit this movie is.
And you know what? The people who say leave your brain at the door, you know what? I never had to leave my brain at the door when I was watching the Transformers on TV, and I never had to do it when I watched Transformers the movie.
Now, I do understand these sentiments from Corey Coleman and his old Spill.com crew, as we were shown in this clip, that we shouldn't have to turn our brains off to watch a film, even one that's often defended as dumb fun like Michael Bay's Transformers films. And that's a perfectly fair response towards anybody who don't seem to realize that the turn your brain off argument is a backhanded one, especially when it's in defense of a certain film. Which is why I intend to be very clear when I say that those arguments shouldn't be expected from me here. After having watched the original trilogy of Bayformer films multiple times in the past, and upon giving them a more recent watch through for this video, I feel very confident in stating that Transformers Dark of the Moon, despite its flaws, and it's got a sizable share of them, believe me, is nowhere near as bad as people like Corey Coleman or Bobsheaux or Red Letter Media would like to lead one to believe. And I intend to prove why that's the case, even with the flaws in mind. Now, I will say that the Bayformer series, by and large, doesn't hold up all that great to scrutiny overall, despite having a personal love for the original trilogy of films and even getting some level of enjoyment from the two that came afterwards. From an objective standpoint, there's more bad installments in the Bayverse than there are good, and even the entries that I would go out of my way to defend still have their issues. Dark of the Moon sits in the latter category, but regardless of my love for the film and the sentimental value I hold for it and its predecessors, I will call out the film's flaws should they arise, while still giving credit where it's due. There's also going to be times throughout this essay video where I will be responding to certain criticisms levied towards the film that don't hold up to scrutiny in and of themselves. And that's mainly due to how a lot of reviews for the film, at least the ones that are more negative, have some pretty crap arguments going on which seriously undermine their takes, even when they do make valid points at times.
The humans in the UN decide that Autobots are bad guys, and that they should leave the planet Earth.
Okay.
Do you remember anything about that?
There's nothing to set that up. 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 There's nothing to set that up.
As a result of the reputation that the Bayverse tends to get, it encourages a lot of bad faith engagement towards the media in question, which causes such crap arguments to arise. And unfortunately, this even comes from some YouTubers whose content I actually enjoy, so I intend to be fair with my critiques towards content from other creators when it comes to their assessments on Dark of the Moon. I understand that the quality of films like Revenge of the Fallen, as well as Age of Extinction and The Last Night, have sadly led discourse surrounding the Bayverse into reaching a point where it's now impossible to contain, hence why even videos that bash the films with broken argumentation tend to get overlooked because they've been able to slip in through the cracks within the zeitgeist. But hopefully this video will help in bringing to light said broken argumentation while also determining that perhaps Dark of the Moon or even the first movie are actually not as bad as many would like to lead one to believe. Flawless? No, but still deserving of a fair shake. So, with all that said and done, it's time for us to start getting right into this discussion / analysis of mine on Transformers Dark of the Moon. Or, as the old saying goes, transform and roll out. Like many of my past essay videos, if not all of them really, it seems appropriate to at least do a quick-ish summary of the plot in order for us to have an idea of what it is that we're going to discuss before we start looking deeper into the details. The premise in Dark of the Moon is that during the war on Cybertron, where the Decepticons were overwhelming the Autobots, a ship called the Ark, helmed by then Autobot leader Sentinel Prime, and carrying vital technology that would help turn the tide, went adrift and eventually crash-landed on the Earth's moon. This crash landing prompted the space race, culminating in the Apollo 11 mission coming to be with the top-secret agenda of uncovering the Ark. Flash forward to present day, 4 years after the events of Revenge of the Fallen, we meet up with Sam Witwicky, played by Shia LaBeouf, who is a post-grad struggling to find a job, but at least he has his beautiful girlfriend, Carly. Carly Spencer, played by Rosie Huntington-Whiteley. Yeah, we'll get more into that later. Sam does manage to get a job, but he finds himself caught in the middle of the Transformer conflict once again when he, along with his ally Seymour Simmons, played by John Turturro, start to uncover a secret plot that Megatron, leader of the Decepticons, is hatching, which involves the Moon Conspiracy, where it is revealed that there are human collaborators working for the cons. Meanwhile, after finding a part of the Ark in Chernobyl, Optimus Prime and the Autobots recover Sentinel Prime and some of its tech, a set of pillars intended to form a space bridge for instant transportation. However, things begin to escalate when Sentinel was revealed to be working with Megatron all along in order to restore Cybertron by bringing it to Earth via a space bridge and enslaving all of humanity. This culminates towards Sam, the Autobots, and Nest, the military group who are allied with the bots, waging one last battle against the Decepticons in a war-torn Chicago that will determine the fate of the world and the human race. Now, after that brief summary, it makes all the sense in the world for us to break down the plot and see how functional it actually is, especially in the context of how this film stacks in continuity with its predecessors. With that said, I won't be using any external material like the novelization or the tie-in comics as a means to either prop up the film or bring it down. since a film should be able to stand on its own and hold up to scrutiny without resorting to such material as a crutch. I am aware that, to give some examples, Skids and Mudflap from Revenge of the Fallen were actually integrated into the scene where Sentinel betrays and kills Ironhide, and it features them suffering a similar fate in one of the tie-in comics. And I'm aware that there was an alternate ending where Megatron and Optimus teamed up to defeat Sentinel, and the former is allowed to leave in one piece after his truce is accepted and after the battle was over, and the ending was featured in the novelization, with the reason why this ending was changed in the final film being the result of it getting leaked online. However, the lack of these scenes should not necessarily reflect the betterment or a detriment in the film itself, if what we actually got instead was sufficient. I also will only be talking about how the storytelling in Dark Moon stacks up in the context of it fitting in continuity with its two predecessors. I won't necessarily be referencing either of its successors, those being Age of Extinction and The Last Night, unless necessary. So without further ado, let's get into this film's plot and world building. The film pretty much follows a formula that we've seen from the first two films, where there's a revelation involving mankind's past and how it links up with Transformers, which kickstarts a race between the Autobots and the Decepticons for a MacGuffin. But then, about halfway through, the formula gets subverted once Sentinel Prime reveals his true colors, and the Decepticons successfully enact their master plan, resulting in the rest of the film transitioning into being a war film, where Optimus and Sam lead the charge against the Decepticons in a last-ditch effort to save the Earth. So the criticism that this film is just a retread of the first film is simply false. Needless to say, if anybody wants to levy that excuse for why this film is bad, then I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Try again. Or better yet, come up with better criticisms next time.
It's just doing the first movie again.
Lay off! So the plot actually kicks off when a fuel cell from the Ark was discovered in Chernobyl, and so the Autobots and Nest retrieve it after an encounter with the Decepticon known as Shockwave and his giant Cybertronian worm beast called the Driller. The film goes on to establish that the Decepticons have set up pillars all over the moon's surface in the 1960s to form a space bridge once Sentinel was eventually woken back up. So the US is aware of the Ark's existence, and they even had the astronauts who partook in the Apollo 11 mission, including but not limited to Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, swear into secrecy about what they uncovered. Later on in the film, two former cosmonauts speak with Sam and Simmons about those pillars that were set up on the moon thanks to some lunar satellite photos that the Russians acquired. We even have a Ukrainian whistleblower who meets with and accompanies Lennox and his team to Chernobyl to acquire the Ark's fuel cell, and this whistleblower is gunned down by Laserbeak, who was spying on them and was waiting for the time to strike to cover the Decepticons' tracks. The fuel cell was acquired by the Russians, who went to secretly study it in Chernobyl's nuclear power plant until the meltdown in 1986. So, this part may seem a bit confusing because it begs the question of how this cell ended up in Chernobyl to begin with. Now, in his video on Dark Moon, Pointless Hub levies the criticism that Charlotte Meering, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, or anyone else in the U.S. government, not knowing how the Russians got the fuel cell, is all just lampshading the fact that Aaron Kruger, the writer of the film, couldn't figure it out himself, nor did he bother doing so.
One thing they haven't showed is how did the Russians get the engine part in the first place? The answer to that is nothing! They just hand wave it away. The entire catalyst of this film has no explanation for how the Russians even got it in the first place.
With this in mind, one can't help but think, yeah, that is a good point. How did the Russians even get the Ark's fuel cell, and why didn't the writer just come up with a reason for how it got there, especially since the rest of the film's plot hinges on the fuel cell being in Chernobyl for the Autobots to find? The film states that the Russians sent unmanned probes that somehow acquired the fuel cell. Now the problem here is that we don't really get the how in terms of the methods for getting the cell. We run into further complications when our heroes find out that the Russians were planning a manned mission to the moon, but the program was shut down due to budget cuts, as well as technical problems which weren't mentioned in this instance, but that is kind of what was going on in real life anyways, so there's that. Hence why Sam and Simmons sought after the two cosmonauts in Washington, one of whom is Peter Parker's landlord himself, Mr. Dickovich. So since there weren't any cosmonauts who ever made it to the moon and no manned mission ever got off the ground, no pun intended, then how did the Soviets even get the fuel cell? Really, all the film had to do was confirm, even with just the subtle hints, that the Russians' missions to collect soil from the moon was also intended to secretly collect a part from the Ark, similarly to how Aldrin and Armstrong were secretly sent to check out the Ark. Or heck, maybe even have it so a Decepticon like Shockwave picked up the fuel cell from the Ark more recently in order to enact this new plan of theirs and put it there to bait the Autobots, as opposed to having the cell be in Chernobyl all this time, decades before the events of this film. It's as if, metaphorically speaking, all the dots are there to draw a line to connect it, but the writer either got scared mid-drawing or figured that audiences would figure it out and put the clues together themselves. I can appreciate the latter, or at least in theory, but there still should have been at least one more clue for audiences to be able to have a eureka moment. One extra tidbit info, one little tweak, would have helped in clarifying how the Russians were able to use the unmanned probes to get the fuel cell, or even just how the fuel cell got into Chernobyl in the first place. Like perhaps one of the probes could have had an extension or modification to make it possible, as opposed to the audience needing to rely on inference for how it happened. Considering that samples from the moon were sent back safely to Earth, we could have had it established that the Soviets, upon knowing about the Ark, secretly fitted one of these unmanned probes with an apparatus that could get the fuel cell, along with a soil sample off the moon and back to Earth. We could also establish that the probe was either able to traverse into the Ark and successfully extract the fuel cell, or just come across the cell among the debris lying around the Ark. Due to the ship having undergone a crash landing, the likelihood of a fuel cell being among the debris is at least feasible enough for that to be the case. And since Armstrong and Aldrin had 20 minutes of oxygen to work with during their exploration, only allowing them to focus on the Ark itself, the Soviets could have their probe snag the fuel cell in a trail of debris and be able to do so before the Americans would. Heck, we don't even need to know exactly which of the three probes, Luna 16, 20, and 24, that successfully landed between 1970 and 1976 was what acquired the cell. And so the line that the Russians somehow picked up the fuel cell is just a matter of the Americans' POV not having the sufficient info to know how it happened. I mean, if the film was willing to go into beat-by-beat detail about how the Apollo 11 mission, this historic event not just for the US but also for the world, was a secret mission to investigate a crashed alien vessel, then why couldn't we get a tiny bit more info for how the Russians' unmanned space missions had a secret agenda as well? So, yeah, it's not another somehow Palpatine returns moment, or at least not to the same damaging extent and with nowhere near the same amount of vagaries. But I can understand how the confusion from Pointless Hub, among others, could come to be. In fact, not explaining or even suggesting how the Soviets got the fuel cell is a pretty big problem, because this is meant to kick off the rest of the movie. So here's some advice for any writers out there, anyone who is aspiring to be a writer. If you're telling a story involving a conspiracy, and you have it so later events occur due to the discovery of an item, you might want to make sure that how the item came to being is explained and makes sense. And please, work harder for your story rather than settling on having your character say, somehow, ... because then you'd get plot holes like this. Anyways, moving right along. After getting the intel from Aldrin, Optimus and Ratchet go up to the moon to retrieve Sentinel and his remaining 5 pillars from the Ark's crash vault. Then, after bringing Sentinel back to Earth, who is revived by Optimus via the Matrix as part of the Decepticons' plan unbeknownst to the latter, we find out that the pillars which Sentinel created are intended to form a space bridge, which is akin to an interplanetary portal system, and use it as a means to transport resources and other Cybertronians from one point to another. And these pillars will eventually be used as the Decepticons' means for bringing more troops down to Earth from the moon, and eventually bringing Cybertron itself to Earth's orbit. Now, for those who may recall, Revenge of the Fallen actually established this part of Transformer lore by having Jetfire use it to teleport some humans and Autobots, including Sam, all the way to Egypt in order to search for the Matrix. And we also see the Fallen use it as a way to easily steal back the Matrix in a surprise attack later in the film. Whereas Jetfire's use of the space bridge was less stable due to his state of being, resulting in him, Sam, and the rest being scattered, the Fallen, being a former Prime, is able to teleport himself with ease and efficiency. Now, the way Revenge of the Fallen implemented the space bridge is rather shoddy, as a way to conveniently get our heroes to where they need to go, as well as to make the villain overpowered, only for him to hilariously never use it again when he fights Optimus. And it complicates what it means for Cybertronians to just teleport themselves and other surrounding beings at will, or how some would have this ability while many others don't. Going back to Dark of the Moon, there is an attempt to at least mitigate the issue by having Sentinel established as the inventor of technology that's intended to form a more stable space bridge that can teleport many Cybertronians and other related entities en masse. As far as mitigations are concerned, it's fine. It doesn't really address how a Seeker like Jetfire or someone like the Fallen have had this ability to teleport themselves and others via the space bridge, but with the use of specific lines from Optimus as well as a showcasing of how the pillars work, there is a clear enough distinction made to suggest that the use of the space bridge invented by Sentinel would be considered not only different from what we see in Revenge of the Fallen, but also a logical and more reliable method, both in-universe and in service of the plot. Later on in the film, when Sentinel brings a bunch of Decepticons from the moon all the way to Earth via a space bridge, the United Nations receive an ultimatum from him and the Decepticons to exile the Autobots and allow the cons to acquire some of Earth's resources before leaving themselves, which the UN goes on to concede. Now I know that someone out there wants to pull the clip from Bumblebee and say that they literally call themselves Decepticons and that it should raise all kinds of red flags, as in they shouldn't be trusted. So, why would the UN make this decision despite everything the Decepticons have done up to this point? I mean, a whole wave of Decepticons showed up in the second film, heralding the Fallen's arrival, and they went on to kill thousands across the globe, and the Fallen even made a public broadcast to the entire world threatening to destroy it unless Sam was turned over. Which means we're gonna have to sort all of this out by asking this one question. How much does the world really know about the Decepticons and who's in charge of them? Sure, Megatron made a rather public appearance in the first movie during the Mission City battle, but how much of the city's populace would put two and two together that he's a leader of sorts when they all would more than likely try to duck and cover while their city gets turned into a war zone? We also have to take into account that after Mission City, the US government opted to terminate Sector 7 and cover it all up, dumping Megatron's body into the Laurentian Abyss along with his fallen Decepticons. Not only that, but Sam and his loved ones are told to be silent about their involvement with the Transformer War and that aliens are among them. Then we flash forward to Revenge of the Fallen, where Megatron is brought back, but he is in league with the Fallen, who gives him the order to broadcast his message to humanity, that being to surrender Sam Witwicky or be destroyed. Before this broadcast, the Decepticons demonstrated their destructive power just by arriving on Earth when the Fallen followed suit, taking out an entire aircraft carrier and wreaking havoc in cities like Paris. So by this point, the only thing that the public would have as a reference for the leader of the Decepticons would be the Fallen, who ends up dying by the end of the second film anyways, as well as the knowledge that the cons are able to cause mass destruction. So now, despite the Autobots' best efforts, the world would be uneasy about having them on Earth as a result of the prior film's events. We even have a scene where Simmons is interviewed by Bill O'Reilly about a book he wrote and published, as well as the matter of the Autobots' current residential status on Earth. O'Reilly states that the general public doesn't even want the Autobots around anymore, given how much of a toll the Cybertronian war on Earth has taken thus far. The UN then gets Sentinel's ultimatum, and while Sentinel hasn't technically taken charge of the Decepticons, he still represents them as their mouthpiece, as their figurehead. So by this point, it's meant to be inferred that Sentinel would be the new leader of the Decepticons, despite Megatron still being around. But his history as a former Autobot leader is meant to be a sort of reassurance that humanity would concede to their demands this time, since the exchange is to just exile the Autobots for the Decepticons to willingly leave themselves after getting some resources. Taking all that backstory into consideration, as well as noting the great power the Decepticons have just recently demonstrated thanks to Sentinel taking back his pillars and unleashing an army of cons in Washington, and the non-negotiable terms he lays out to the UN, it would be understandable why a hasty decision was made by the UN to accept those terms and make good on them. So basically, the public, if they were to be aware of Megatron being an entity, supposedly views him now as just a commander of the Decepticons, but one who shares that power with other leaders. One who was depicted as ruthless in his ultimatum, but dies at the end of Revenge of the Fallen, and one who is willing to offer an easier ultimatum, with seemingly less ulterior motives for humanity to concede to, regardless of the Decepticons' prior actions. Basically, and this is to paraphrase The Dark Knight, the Cybertronian war on Earth has hammered humanity to the point of desperation until they found themselves in a position where they conceded to an entity that they didn't fully understand, and that ended up biting them in the ass. My main thing is that some of these details in the world building should have been more concrete as opposed to us needing to connect the dots that the writers could have just done themselves. I understand that we don't have the time to go into too many extensive details on that part of the world building, considering the ground Darkened Moon already needs to cover in its narrative, but maybe an extra scene or even some extra lines of dialogue would have sufficed in painting the clearest picture possible for the public's in-universe knowledge on something like the Decepticons' current hierarchy, which certainly would help if we were to get a sequel to Darkened Moon that would explore the after effects of its events, or whatever. Anyways, moving on from there. Later in the film, once the Decepticons have seemingly wiped out the Autobots and start reducing Chicago to ruin in order to make a fortress out of it for their final push towards bringing Cybertron to Earth, there is the question of why wouldn't the US government, or heck, any other government, try to nuke Chicago? Well, let's put it this way. Launching a nuke, whether it's the US doing it towards one of its own cities or another country doing it towards the US, would be a terrible idea for a multitude of reasons. 1. The Decepticons have the city sealed off, and any attempts to survey it with either drones or satellites are countered by fighters, as well as certain cons jamming the satellite signals, potentially using EMP technology, which would prevent anyone from being able to get any info on the situation regarding what the cons are planning beyond fortifying the city. The US also has infantry set up outside of the city, and Lennox's team is on standby to prep for retaliation anyways. So, launching a nuke without sufficient info on the situation, or while the US is currently trying to deal with it, would be a very bad look for whoever commits to said launch. I will say, though, it is pretty lucky for one drone to not only be able to get into Chicago without being spotted by fighters to survey the tower that Dylan resides in, but that after Laserbeak flings it into an engine on Bumblebee's fighter, it's still in working enough condition for Sam, Carly, and Epps to get some ground zero intel on the situation to Meering and company. Had the thing been more significantly damaged, our heroes probably would have been screwed, but I digress. 2. If bombers and drones can't get in, just as General Morshower states is the case, then a nuke would most certainly be countered. And even if a nuke was launched, there are Decepticons like Starscream who would be more than willing and capable of stopping the nuke before it reached Chicago. And that would result in a widespread blackout across the US, which would make things even worse for our heroes, full stop. Surveillance tech, vehicles, the works would all be totally screwed. And considering how advanced the Decepticons' technology is, the blackout may not even cripple them due to it being alien in origin and potentially having countermeasures for such a scenario. 3. Even if a nuke successfully hits Chicago, and if it was able to destroy the Decepticon invaders, other countries that are enemies of the US could potentially take advantage of this moment of weakness and exploit it. And if it was another country that sent the nuke, then we could be seeing World War III happening in whatever country that was responsible for nuking a US city, whether it was out of necessity or not, whether the US was made aware of it or not, would have a target on its back. Basically, the implications of nuking Chicago would be too severe for any country, even the US itself, to take that kind of risk. That would either backfire significantly or would result in grave, long-term consequences. I understand that geopolitics being used to defend a Bayformer film may be offensive to some of you out there, and I'm very sorry that it offends you. But the facts of the matter don't care about how you feel, and I'm just the messenger who's here to relay them. So, there's that out of the way. Now onto how the Autobots and Nest operate in the world circa Dark of the Moon. With the Decepticons still in hiding, the Autobots have been partaking in settling human-oriented conflicts, as we see when Bumblebee, Dino, and Sideswipe raid an illegal nuclear weapons facility in the Middle East. This moment gets referenced by Charlotte Meering as being the reason for her paying Nest a visit in Washington to discuss the diplomatic complications that the Autobots have seemingly spurred by raiding that facility. This is also meant to reinforce the uneasy, complicated relationship the public has with the Autobots, which will, albeit partially, inform the UN greenlighting their exile later in the film. This does beg the question of why Optimus would be okay with his Autobots intervening like this, especially when Nest doesn't even get any notice on it, as Lennox goes on to tell Meering. You'd think it would be in the Autobots' best interest that they would give Nest or somebody in a position of power the heads up on that, or even if it's okay for them to help out, especially when they don't want to further complicate their relations with those countries, let alone humanity as a collective. Let's just stop and think about this. A team of Autobots who have primarily taken residence in the United States have just went out and committed an unsanctioned raid at an illegal nuclear weapons plant on foreign soil without any sort of approval from any higher up in the US government or even from Lennox, who is in charge of Nest, which would complicate the US's relations with the other country, which would complicate the Autobots' relations with their earthly neighbors. So why would the Autobots take these kinds of risks? For that matter, why would Optimus Prime, the Autobot leader who's all for allowing humanity the room necessary to learn from its own mistakes, seem to give the okay to something like this when there is obviously some understandable tension between humanity and Cybertronians, especially when he knows that the Autobots need to be on Earth because the Decepticons are still around? I'm all for there being some connective tissue to inform certain decisions that will be made later in the film, as well as the presence of a certain character, but I can't help but think Optimus and the Autobots were kinda gooberish for this. Just want to put that out there. Now, I also want to bring up some of the strange physics for Cybertron being teleported to Earth's orbit for a moment. Considering that Cybertron is a much bigger planet than Earth, it does beg the question of how the Decepticons would be able to account for the gravitational issues that such a large mass being in close proximity to the planet they're trying to exploit would bring. Even with only a part of Cybertron managing to be teleported through before the process was stopped a couple times, once temporarily and another being permanent, this is kind of a weird thing to think about, granted, but still valid when we consider how the physics of planets orbiting around the sun work. Not to mention, the part of Cybertron that did make it through before the space bridge dissipated is still just as big, if not bigger, than Earth itself. Now, this wouldn't be that much of an issue since Dark and Moon was initially intended to be the conclusion of the Bayverse. However, since the Bayverse didn't end here, and since the two films set after Dark and the Moon never addressed the potential planetary ramifications of Cybertron being partially in Earth's orbit, only to have The Last Night involve an even greater cataclysm, like parts of Cybertron literally dragging across parts of Earth as well as the Moon, the consequences of Cybertron being within Earth's orbit should have been more properly addressed upon retrospect. There's also the matter of energon detectors, like what we see during one of Optimus's narrations. These devices are established to have been set up in cities like Washington, D.C. in order to monitor Cybertronian activity. In fact, the detectors are able to get a ping on the Dreads when they're in pursuit of Sentinel, and we even get a line about energon detectors getting pings of Decepticons across the globe who are prepping to send pillars out in space later in the film. We also get a line from Optimus' narration regarding long-range air defenses being implemented to account for Decepticons like Starscream. Pretty effective stuff, I must say, especially as a means for our heroes to account for any Decepticons trying to secretly roam around. Too bad they never seem to get a ping on Soundwave when he's in Washington and disguised as a Mercedes-Benz that Carly drives around, nor was Megatron ever pinged. And it's also a shame that we never see or hear from these long-range defenses, since Starscream is shown to be flying around freely, like when he goes to shoot down the Xanthium, as well as the fact that Decepticons were able to get to other parts of the globe without said defenses to account for. I can understand if those defenses were overwhelmed or even disabled by the Decepticons that came from the moon who were capable of fighting back if need be, but what about the cons that need to get around before that? In fact, come to think of it, how did Soundwave and Laserbeak get from Africa to the United States without a flight mode and without being detected? Actually, better question. How did Megatron get from Africa to the US without a flight mode? Did they hitch a ride on a boat like the Constructicons did in Revenge of the Fallen? In fact, Megatron's alt mode, despite being a pretty badass looking truck mode, would raise all kinds of red flags if it was seen on the road. I mean, the rust, the blades jutting out from all over the front, the drape hanging from the back. There's no way that he would be driving around in Washington or Chicago without somebody noticing and possibly reporting it, let alone any energon detectors getting a ping on him. You wouldn't be able to get away with driving a truck like this on I-95 without police pulling you over without it being a Decepticon. Also, I get Laserbeak is shown to be a very efficient assassin slash infiltrator by disguising himself as electronic appliances fitting for his size, from a computer screen and printer to a TV screen and even a mini bumblebee. But how was he able to sneak into Sam's workplace to disguise himself as Jerry Wang's computer, and then sneak his way into becoming a printer in the office after killing Wang? Even one of the employees there makes a remark about a new printer suddenly showing up in the office. You'd think that people would be a bit more cautious about these types of things, given the fact that Cybertronians, alien robots that can disguise themselves as electronics, big or small, have been public knowledge since the second film. Well, technically it would have been the first film, despite the cover-up BS that the second film tries to pull, due to the fact that Mission City saw a bunch of Cybertronians battling and wreaking havoc there, but I digress. Granted, it wouldn't be unheard of for governments to try to cover up events which involved human suffering, regardless of how many witnesses would claim the contrary, but given the amount of collateral damage and loss of human life that we collectively see in the first two films, one would think that it would be ridiculous for anyone in the US government, or any government for that matter, to even try to enforce a cover-up at this point. It would have been nice if we had something akin to Soundwave perhaps having developed a technology to account for the energon detectors and long-range defenses for himself, Laserbeak, and other high-ranking Decepticons, including Megatron. Or maybe even have it where the Decepticons had a human collaborator working within a part of Nest to rig the system so that those high-ranking cons would be able to do their thing before he's killed by Laserbeak when he's no longer needed. I won't go as far as Alistair Haken does in saying that the energon detectors and defenses should have been cut out entirely, because then we'd be asking the question of why, after several years, mankind never thought to set things like those up in the first place, especially after what happened in the previous film. However, I do think that if you're gonna introduce something like energon detectors and long-range defenses in your world, you might want to account for these beyond just a couple of mentions of Decepticons being detected and long-range defenses being mentioned once during one of Optimus's narrations and never reference it again, to where certain scenes treat them as if they never even existed. Anyways, moving right along, we also have a certain aspect of the Transformer race and how they function that has been changed since the second film, and I kinda want to address it real quick. It's pretty minor, as you'll soon find out, but just bear with me. The aspect which I refer to involves how the Transformers implement their weapons. Now, Alistair Haken made a Longman style critique on Age of Extinction that, aside from some points here and there, was pretty much on point in terms of breaking down everything that is wrong with that movie. Hence why, in case I do another essay vid on a Transformers film, you'll more than likely won't see me do one for Age of Extinction. But one of the few points in the video which I want to dig into here relates to how Lockdown, one of the primary villains in the fourth movie, was using handheld weapons that he could easily lose during combat, despite having built-in weapons which would be a safer bet when trying to take down Optimus Prime. Haken goes on to state that this issue started in Dark of the Moon.
He takes a crane hook and latches it onto Lockdown. He yanks him off his feet as his gun flies out of his hand. Why in the hell did you change the Cybertronian weapons to be handheld instead of built-in? It didn't start with this movie either. It started in Dark of the Moon. Michael Bay wanted his little Mexican standoff scene with Ironhide and Sideswipe, but it makes so much less sense from an in-universe perspective.
I do agree that the Bayverse should have done more to justify the Cybertronians not all having built-in weapons, or why they would result to using those that are handheld, so that sequences like the Mexican standoff in Dark of the Moon could happen more naturally. While Ironhide gets a pass since he was using newer weapons that he got from Q, and since he lost one of his cannons back in Revenge of the Fallen, more on that in a bit, it does raise the question of why Sideswipe doesn't have built-in weapons despite never losing the one he had back in the prior film, or why the Dreads don't have their guns connected either. Even Optimus Prime makes a bit more sense considering his trailer transforms into a mobile armory with weapons and the like that he can interchangeably use. That being said, in universe, it would make more sense for Cybertronians to have built-in weapons, where their arms or other parts of their bodies transform into weapons, which we mainly see in the first film, like Bumblebee's arm cannon, or to have their weapons connect more securely like Optimus's blasters. However, having a Cybertronian be able to detach their weapons at will, or even forced out, has been a thing since Revenge of the Fallen, such as when we see Ironhide willingly dislodge a cannon of his in order to increase his speed when running away from the bombing site, or when certain protoforms have their rifles blasted off or out of their arms by human artillery. So, Dark of the Moon was staying consistent with what we were shown in the previous film. It's just the logic behind why a character like Sideswipe, who never lost any weapons he had in Revenge of the Fallen, would resort to handheld pistols despite the potential for a tactical disadvantage. So, in regards to Alistair Haken's points, the issue isn't quite as bad as he stated it was in Dark of the Moon's case, but it is still pretty iffy. He is right about Age of Extinction's case, though, considering that Lockdown was shown to have multiple weapons and he resorts to handheld ones for the sake of that film's plot, when it would be advantageous for him to use the ones that he has built in to achieve his goals more quickly. Also, speaking of Alistair, I recommend you all check out his video on Transformers Dark of the Moon. Despite it being released on April Fool's, it is not a joke video, but actually a pretty good discussion vid on why the film is quite underappreciated, warts and all. Us Dark of the Moon fans gotta stick together, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, moving along. In Dark of the Moon, we're also introduced to what is referred to as Stealth Force, where a Cybertronian remains in their alt mode, but they transform slightly so that they can use their weapons for vehicular combat, without them needing to have weapons already built into their alt mode, of course. We primarily see Bumblebee use this a couple times throughout the film, as well as Sideswipe during the highway chase, both for firing upon certain targets, like a Decepticon or a checkpoint for an illegal nuclear weapons plant in Iran, and for taking evasive action, such as when the Dreads throw vehicles at the Autobots to try and slow them down. The film doesn't make it clear on whether or not this is a new ability that the Autobots acquired in-universe thanks to the likes of Q, so we're just left wondering why this wasn't a thing from the beginning, or why the Decepticons don't use it themselves, or even have it. Suffice it to say, I can't help but think that Stealth Force would be pretty useful during sequences like when Bumblebee is being pursued by Barricade in the first film as an example. Or heck, maybe like when Bumblebee or one of the other Autobots uses it against Barricade and Bone Crusher on the way to Mission City. So, needless to say, based on what we've gone over so far, certain world-building additions that Dark of the Moon provides do raise some questions that could have easily been addressed, or could have just been averted altogether. But nothing too egregious, at least, except for, well, obviously the whole thing with the fuel cell. But one last little detail in the world building that I want to address is in regards to how Cybertronians, namely protoforms, are shown to be operating ships in this film, despite the fact that we've seen them get to Earth and other planets just fine without said ships, since they turn into spacefaring vessels themselves. Now get ready folks, because we are about to go into a whole nother discussion altogether, but it's still going to remain relevant to the world building aspect, so just stick with me here. The protoform point is one of many criticisms towards this film by a YouTuber named Bobsheaux in his review on Dark of the Moon, where he went through the plot in a similar style as Doug Walker's character, the Nostalgia Critic. While there are some valid criticisms which he levies towards this film, there are also points from him which are just plain baffling. So let's go over some of those points, shall we? First, the protoform argument, as I previously mentioned, where he states that the Autobots and Decepticons are shown using ships like the Ark and various gunships / troop carriers for traversal.
And hey, look at that! 1 minute into the movie, and we see that the Transformers have spaceships. You know, those things that they couldn't imagine them having, because why would they need ships where they can just become ships?
The Ark and carrier ships were specifically designed to transport multiple protoforms at once. Also, in the case of the Ark, Sentinel's mission to transport his pillars to Earth was meant to start with a desperate escape from Cybertron, hence the limited amount of crew members on board. And the ship was supposed to have had hundreds of pillars, which is meant to be secret cargo. So having hundreds of protoforms carrying all those pillars leave the planet at the same time would be impractical, as well as suspicious to those who aren't in the know. And even with all that in mind, with the protoforms being Autobots, Sentinel would want to bring as few of them as possible because he doesn't want his true agenda to be made apparent in any way to the rest of the Autobot faction. Also, just because a protoform can transform into a spacefaring vessel on its own, that doesn't account for the possibility of them being attacked, since we're never shown that protoforms have any defenses that come up when they're in their entry modes. Thus, the existence of gunships and troop carriers would account for such a lack of defenses. Second, the notion that the US was motivated by the Ark's arrival on the moon to try to get there before the Russians, while the Russians were unfazed by it, is not true.
This is what motivates the US into its first manned lunar mission. The Soviets already landed on the moon with an unmanned probe before America did. If this is what accelerated America's efforts to get to the moon, there's no reason to think that the Soviets wouldn't be similarly motivated, and with their foot already in the door, they would have beaten us.
The film explicitly states that the US had reason to believe that the Soviets were aware of the Ark being there as well, hence why JFK gave the order for NASA to ensure that they get to the moon first. This is all in the clips that you're showing in your own video, Bob. How are you not picking this up? In fact, the Russians knowing about the Ark is confirmed later on when the cosmonauts tell Sam and Simmons about Luna 4 getting images of the pillars being moved on the moon's surface in 1963. We also have to keep in mind that Russia was never able to send any cosmonauts to the moon in real life due to the technical problems that resulted in the failure of their human lunar program. So even with the extra motivation in mind, who's to say that this wasn't the case in the film's canon? Which, by the way, it is. Next, let's go over a couple of smaller points that are still just too obnoxious for me to ignore.
We then get a little flashback where we see Sam get a Medal of Honor for doing something that the government has to cover up. I have no idea how that works.
The government gave Sam a medal for his heroics back in Egypt, where he nearly died to help save the world, so he kinda earned it anyways. But even with the government still wanting him and his family to be hush-hush about his involvement, a medal and photo op with the president behind closed doors wouldn't hurt so that Sam would have something to return home with that was worth the trouble. Another one is how Bob states that Brains doesn't do anything smart despite his namesake.
He sounds like Beavis from Beavis and Butthead, and he doesn't do anything intelligent in this movie, so of course his name is Brains!
Even though we see him do thorough research for Sam and Simmons with fruitful results, those being the two cosmonauts that they speak to shortly after, as well as him and Wheelie stealing a Decepticon gunship, resulting in them flying into a troop carrier and going on to sabotage it in order to help their Autobot friends. Would I call it convenient that Wheelie and Brains stumbled upon a Decepticon gunship, were able to hotwire it or do something to get it powered up and flying, careen it into a troop carrier, sneak out of it without any cons noticing them despite them crashing into the hangar bay, and make their way into a part of the ship for them to sabotage it just in time before Bumblebee and the rest of the Autobots could be executed? Yes, that I can concede to in terms of things to critique the film on, but I digress. Anyway, next big point, the Xanthium, a space shuttle modified with Cybertronian technology which the Autobots use both to retrieve Sentinel and to seemingly attempt to leave Earth. Let's hear what Bob has to say about it.
If you have an Autobot spacecraft, then what are you doing here instead of flying back to Cybertron?
Look here! Look, listen!
Okay, seriously, Bob, how is this not apparent to you? So, you know the Decepticons, the faction of genocidal evil robots that the Autobots have been fighting a war against over the past couple of films? In Dark of the Moon, the Decepticons are still alive and in hiding, and both the Autobots and Nest are well aware of it, hence why they've been keeping their eyes open for their return, because they know Megatron is still around and potentially plotting another scheme. In fact, Optimus and Lennox's team encounter a very dangerous Decepticon named Shockwave and his driller in Chernobyl at the start of the film. Why in the hell would the Autobots leave Earth if the Decepticons are still on it? Optimus even asked Galloway in Revenge of the Fallen about the possibility that the Decepticons won't leave mankind alone should the Autobots depart from Earth at the US government's request. So if the Autobots were to just leave Earth on their own accord without mankind requesting them to do so, while their war with the Decepticons on Earth is still in effect, that would be so out of character for the Autobots, especially for Optimus, that it would be insane. Setting Age of Extinction aside. In the words of a fellow Sea King, did you watch the film? So anyways, how about some more exhibits? Bob also criticizes the fact that humanity will be used as slave labor for the Decepticons' restoration efforts.
The Decepticons want humans to rebuild their civilization? You're a race of robots! You know how to build other robots to do your bidding!
Even for as big as Cybertron is compared to Earth, 6 billion humans is still a pretty large labor force. Or, well, 7 billion if we go off of what Starscream said in the second film. Not to mention, the Allspark is gone, as well as other means to build and sustain a new army have also been depleted and or destroyed over the course of the first 2 films. In fact, when we meet Megatron in Africa, he's giving out little scarce bits of energon or some sort of sustenance to some hatchlings that were sort of left over from after the events of the second movie. So the Decepticons don't have a means to increase their numbers, especially considering that what they currently have is shown to be pretty sufficient. Not just for invading Chicago, but for carrying out the Space Bridge plan. Even after the Decepticons kill scores of humans in Chicago, which is mainly done to fortify the city as well as to send a message to humanity of the power that they have, there's still billions of humans that would be at their disposal once their plan is complete. So basically, due to their limited numbers, the Decepticons would certainly use the human race as slave labor, not just for their convenience, but also to demonstrate more of their power over them. Now, taking the Tismy physics of teleporting a large planetary body to the proximity of another aside, the Decepticons teleporting Cybertron to Earth would be vastly more convenient and less taxing and time-consuming for them than if they were to just teleport humans to Cybertron in a similar way as what we see in the Twilight Zone episode To Serve Man, which is what would be happening if the Decepticons were to go this way instead of just teleporting Cybertron. There's a potential for some humans to try and rebel while portions of the Decepticons are off-world, especially considering that unlike the Canaanites in To Serve Man, the Decepticons will have already made their ulterior motives well known by this point, and they would absolutely want to have as much control over humanity as possible. So really, why go through a lengthy and potentially risky process of transporting humans off-world and out to a faraway star system when bringing the planet that the slave labor will be forced to rebuild to them is just as feasible and is an easier alternative? Oh, but wait, we ain't done yet. How about this example where Bob briefly, and I do mean briefly, critiques the scene where Q gives Sam and company some gadgetry.
Q the Jewbot gives Sam a grappling hook and some grenades, which comes into direct violation with Optimus's insistence that they not build weapons for the humans.
So in this case, Bob would have a valid point, since Optimus did tell Galloway, a liaison for the US government back in the second film, that the Autobots wouldn't give them their technology due to the potential for mankind to use it for warfare, which would lead to dire consequences. However, what Bob left out of here is context that would only upend his point. As we see in the film, the only humans who are lent some of Q's tech, such as boomsticks and a grappling hook, are Sam and members of Nest, a strike force founded for the specific purpose of helping the Autobots fight against the Decepticons. Not to mention, when Sam and company are provided this tech, it is during the Battle of Chicago, where basically all hands must be on deck should the Earth be saved, and the Autobots would need all the help that they could get. On top of all that, since the Autobots have to draw the Decepticons' attention away from the humans, and since Q is the Autobots' quartermaster, if anything, it would be strange if he didn't provide Sam and company any means of defending themselves, or if Optimus wouldn't approve of it during this battle in particular. So yeah, nice try, Bob, but no dice. Oh, hey guys, check out this next bit where Bob, for some unholy reason, states how Sentinel asserting his dominance over Megatron points to how their deal was the latter surrendering to the former's terms.
No, seriously! That's what happened! The movie wants us to think that Sentinel is a backstabbing tool for making a deal with Megatron, but Megatron's getting the short end of the stick here. He didn't make a deal with Sentinel, he surrendered on his terms.
No, Sentinel made the deal because the Decepticons were winning the war and forcing the Autobots to flee while Cybertron was on the brink of being uninhabitable. And this isn't just apparent in this film, either through Optimus's opening narration or when Sentinel reveals himself as the film's twist villain. This was apparent since the first movie, where we clearly see Megatron in a desolate part of the planet with bodies everywhere, implying that the Decepticons were winning the war for Cybertron, hence why the Allspark was sent out into space. Objectively, Sentinel making the deal with Megatron was not the Autobots winning the war. It signposted the Decepticons being so far ahead in terms of winning as a result of them being able to get one of the Autobots' most prominent figureheads to their side, to where Megatron refers to Sentinel as his greatest triumph. Ergo, this is as far from an Autobot victory as you can get. Also, Megatron is clearly not in a good position to fight back with ease after what he went through in the second film, and the only reason why he was able to overpower Sentinel during the climax was because he had the element of surprise. If Megatron was in peak condition, Sentinel would certainly face greater difficulty in subverting him, to where Megatron would more than likely get his many followers to assist him in killing Sentinel in retaliation. Oh, but wait, this gets even better.
There is no reason for Sentinel to have kept his plans a secret from the Autobots. Was he worried that they might object to his plan on beaming Cybertron next to Earth and enslaving humanity? But if that's the case, that only gives him more reason to take back the Matrix to resume total command over them.
What the hell are you talking about, you crazy clown goblin? Why would Optimus and the rest of the Autobots even allow for Sentinel to take the Matrix back only to use his newly regained leadership status for tyrannical purposes? Based on what we know of the Autobots and their stance on freedom being the right of all sentient beings and all that, they would never accept Sentinel ordering them to help him rebuild Cybertron by enslaving Earth. Sentinel's deal with Megatron and his ulterior motives being kept undisclosed was the biggest advantage that Decepticons ever had, because Sentinel knew damn well that Optimus and the Autobots wouldn't agree to it at all. Whether or not Sentinel would accept the Matrix when Optimus offers it to him would be completely irrelevant. To all the fans of Bobsheaux who may be watching this, I have to ask, and I do so as respectfully as I can, do any of you find this video of his to be good? And if you do, please tell me why. I need to know, because based on the examples that we've gone over so far, I struggle to see how anyone could call it a good video with rock-solid arguments for why Dark of the Moon is bad. I'm just at a total loss here. Okay, one last example for the road, since a good chunk of Bob's other points were either already addressed by me, albeit indirectly so, prior to the section, or will be addressed later. So, you guys know the scene when the Autobots arrive in Chicago to, as Optimus puts it, take the battle to them? Yeah, well, apparently Bob has a thing or two to say about it, so let's take a listen.
Wow, Optimus, that was very nice, thank you. I do have one question, however. Was it absolutely necessary for you to wait until after the Decepticons had rained all kinds of death and destruction on the world? I mean, thousands of innocent people are now dead, and that must have been part of your master plan, right?
This argument, this friggin' argument, has vexed me for the longest time. Not to mention, Bob wasn't the first, nor has he been the last to make this dunderheaded point, since it's been made since the film first released.
Anytime where you have a movie where the main hero, Optimus Prime, decides to hide in a birthday cake and let the Decepticons kill every mother in Chicago, only to go out, surprise, we actually didn't leave, we just wanted to teach you a lesson, right. You know?
Okay, so my following response here will not just address Bobsheaux or the folks from Spill.com, but to address anyone out there who even dares to try to reiterate this argument. First off, the Autobots needed the Decepticons to believe that they were gone, so that they'd be able to get into the city with the element of surprise on their side. This is explicitly stated by Optimus himself in this scene. Second, back in Revenge of the Fallen, Galloway, being a mouthpiece for the US government, as well as that of the members of mankind who don't want any Cybertronians on Earth at all, was under the belief that the Decepticons were on Earth because the Autobots, their enemies, were also there. So he asked if the Autobots would willingly leave should their continued presence no longer be of mankind's benefit, and Optimus stated that they would honor that request because that's within humanity's right to ask that of them. However, Optimus imparted a very important question. What if we leave and you're wrong? And so what happens in Dark of the Moon after the Autobots were exiled and seemingly killed, what happens in Chicago proved Optimus right. Not because Optimus wanted to be proven right, but because despite everything, the world's leaders didn't understand the Decepticons as an enemy faction the way the Autobots do. And so the Autobots, knowing that humanity would need them now more than ever, created a contingency plan to secretly fake their deaths so that they would have an advantage over the cons later on. Third, none of the Autobots can fly from where the Xanthium crashed all the way to Chicago. They all can only transform into cars and trucks. 2 of them are too small to cover any meaningful distance without assistance anyways, and Optimus, despite having flight tech, is just one bot who cannot take on a whole army of Decepticons by himself, no matter how badass he is, considering that he struggled against 3 Decepticons all at once in the last film, where he straight up died. So it's not like the Autobots wanted to be unable to save Chicago from getting its equivalent of the Gorman Massacre, but rather the reason for why they didn't save it was because they physically couldn't get there in time. Heck, considering that Sam and Epps made the trip to Chicago before them, it took them a whole night to get there. And Optimus can't go on ahead of his Autobots by himself because he's gonna need all the help he can get, which wouldn't be able to get there for several hours. These reasons, which I've laid out, are all in the film, as well as supported by prior films. So don't even try to tell me that the Autobots were somehow wrong for this. And this now begs the question again, not just to Bob, not just to the guys from Spill.com, but to anybody who does make this point. Did you watch the film? And if you have, promptly withdraw from this crap argument for the love of God. So, anyways, moving right along. These exhibits that I've just gone over are just a few examples of where Bob was criticizing the movie in ways that misrepresent it more than anything. Not to say that there aren't any valid critiques that he makes, i.e. the fact that Ironhide causes collateral damage by kicking crankcase and a truck into a shop, which results in a fiery explosion that could have potentially killed some people either outside or inside the car.
So yeah, then we get a fight scene with the Autobots, who incidentally don't care about how many civilians are killed in their incredibly nonchalant wake.
But sadly, those valid points don't come up enough to make up for the shortcomings. That and a decent chunk of Bob's criticisms are about how annoying he finds Sam and the comedy by extension to be, which is textbook subjectivity right then and there, because all someone like me has to do as a rebuttal is to say that I find him to be endearing and the comedy to be funny. In fact, I would argue that a better case can be made for why someone would find Sam to be endearing and not at all annoying because of what he goes through and how he deals with it. It's like when someone says a movie is bad because they found it to be boring. When you make a declarative statement like a movie being good or bad, and you try to substantiate it with your personal experience with it, or your personal feelings towards it, without any objective examples, then your thesis will fall apart at its foundation. Now, this is not to say that Bob isn't capable of substantiating his perspective with evidence that's in the film itself which he's reviewing. But if his review is filled with incorrect statements and appeals to subjectivity like him viewing Sam as annoying and the comedy to be unfunny, then what can I really say other than that Bob may actually have a bad take on Dark of the Moon here? In fact, the irony in hearing Bob talk about how obnoxious he finds the film to be when he does stuff like this is kind of beautiful in a really sick, perverted way, granted. But snide remark aside, the main thing is that Bobsheaux has a clear bias against the film and the Bayverse as a whole, and when making his video on Dark of the Moon, he wasn't able to separate that bias enough so that it didn't compromise its quality. And I know that someone would respond by saying that I have a bias in favor of Dark of the Moon, hence my need to defend it. Though all I have to do in disproving that is point to the parts of this video up to now, as well as afterwards, where I do criticize the parts of the film's storytelling that do damage its overall quality. Because I intend to be as objective with my assessments on media as possible, regardless of whether I personally like or dislike that media. So, there is that. The most unfortunate thing about all this is that Bobsheaux is just one of many in a slurry of reviewers who have critiqued this film in bad faith and making it come off as much worse than it actually is. That is a large part of why I made this video in the first place, because I'm just tired of hearing the poorest of poor arguments against this film or the Bayverse in general over and over again go unchallenged, that are all made in bad faith, even if unintentionally. And I say this as someone who, even when batting for its merits, is willing to acknowledge that Dark of the Moon isn't without its issues. Which, why don't we get back into talking about them before I further descend into madness? Please.
It's like, I have no idea what that was about.
No, seriously, please, let's get back to the film itself already.
Lasers shoot off into outer space as the planet comes into the galaxy, and the zub, 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 zub. And then the next line is, Optimus!
Okay, for real, stop right now. I can't take any more of the bilge.
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
Now, when it comes to the plot, we have to talk a good bit about the Decepticons' plan and see not only whether or not it holds up to scrutiny in its own right, but also how it tracks within the overall continuity up to this point. So the plan concocted by our antagonists in this film began back on Cybertron during the Civil War. Sentinel Prime made a deal with Megatron in order to restore the planet and save the Cybertronian race by any means necessary, and that even includes using another planet and potentially its inhabitants as resources for that restoration. Sentinel leaves Cybertron with his pillars, and then the Ark crashes on the moon after it went adrift in outer space as a result of getting shot up by Decepticon fighters on the way out, which would have been done to keep up the ruse that Sentinel was trying to escape. This does bring a sizable amount of attention to how lucky it is that the Ark just so happened to drift off into space until it crashed on the Earth's moon. It would have been nice if we got some detail about how it was able to get to Earth despite the condition it was in. Like perhaps the Autobots on the Ark were able to set the ship to go directly towards Earth so that it wouldn't stray off course in case things start to go wrong. We do get a subtle hint that the Autobots were killed by Sentinel Prime instead of the crash, since protoforms are known to survive crash landings like what we see in the first two films anyway. Sentinel killing these Autobots as a way to cover his tracks before putting himself into stasis is a greater likelihood, though a flashback or even an extra, albeit subtle detail of this being the case would have sufficed, but there's that. Now I'm gonna jump ahead for this part here, but I do want to highlight it. I really dig how clever Dylan and the Decepticons were in ensuring that things go according to plan by having certain pieces fall into place when they needed to be, such as subtly baiting the Autobots in Nest into getting to Ark's fuel cell in order to find Sentinel there, as well as having Dylan, who is a member of Akaretta's board, send a recommendation letter to Bruce for Sam to get hired there in order for the Decepticons to get that much closer to him, and secretly hook Carly up with Soundwave after seeing Sam having trouble with his car. It goes to show that there was some thought put into having the film's events line up in an organic and logical manner, proving that Dark of the Moon actually has better writing than one would tend to believe is the case. So basically the plan to bring Sentinel back and have him bring Cybertron to Earth's orbit in order to enslave humanity into restoring it makes a good bit of sense. Except when you consider that Soundwave was around since the 1970s, as Dylan Gold goes on to state, since he inherited the Decepticon from his late father, who worked with NASA during the Apollo 11 mission. Dylan states his father worked in budget reviewing for NASA and kept fudging the numbers so that the subsequent Apollo missions would cease to continue, similarly to how budget cuts shut down Russia's lunar program that were, in actuality, the result of reviewing by some Decepticon allies on their end. By establishing this, the film creates a pretty noticeable crack in the Bayverse's continuity, because if he had been around all this time, which is also suggested to be the case by a brief montage of clippings from assassinations that he and Laserbeak committed during that period of time, Soundwave would have had the time to find the location of both Megatron and the Allspark before Sam would even be born. I get that this lends credence to how the Decepticons got to Earth before the Autobots did, hence Optimus's line in the first film that they were already too late, but given how capable Soundwave is shown to be in terms of hacking and infiltration, even if he was given a direct order by Megatron himself to not make a move regarding Sentinel since they still needed the Matrix of leadership to revive him, the fact that Soundwave was around this whole time would suggest that he would have at least helped in uncovering the Allspark's location so that the Decepticons would have that base covered. By that point, the Decepticons wouldn't need Blackout to attack the Soxent Air Base in Qatar, nor would they need Frenzy to infiltrate Air Force One, nor would they even need to find out about Archibald Witwicky and his glasses if Soundwave just did his thing and kept digging. Like, what was he doing all this time? And I understand that NASA wouldn't have access to that kind of information since Sector 7 was meant to be a separate and more secretive branch entirely, but the fact that Soundwave apparently didn't or wouldn't even try is a bit of a stretch to say the least. The only other reason for why Soundwave wouldn't have done this is because he doesn't know the Three Kings riddle, nor would he be able to figure it out on his own, that he has to go to the Pillars of Petra to uncover the Tomb of the Primes and find the Matrix, which he would need to wake Sentinel up with. Then again, it would turn to the dust in his hands anyways, because he wouldn't be worthy of it, nor is he a Prime. Though then again, the Matrix never dissolved into Fallen's hands, despite the fact that he's objectively less worthy of having access to the thing than Sam, because he turned his back on the principles of a Prime that he was meant to uphold, and he was actively trying to use it for evil anyways, unlike Sam, who needed it to bring Optimus, the last Prime, back to life. Granted, this is an issue with Revenge of the Fallen because that was the film where the Matrix was introduced in the Bayverse. But like I said a while back in this video, we're going off of the canon of the Bayverse as we've seen in the first two films in order to determine how the third film fares in terms of being a functional story while working within continuity. Anyways, to get back on track, even if the Matrix couldn't be found right away, getting Megatron back and finding the Allspark would certainly be pretty high up in Soundwave's list of priorities if him being around since the 70s was the case. Also, if Dylan inherited Soundwave on Earth, and it would be safe to assume that he would have an Earth-based vehicle mode at that time since he's still supposed to be a robot in disguise, how did he get back up to Earth's orbit in order to be a Cybertronian satellite to do his spying up there? Did he sneak into a space shuttle at some point? Is he a triple changer and he was able to fly up there? I am so confused by this con, and the fact that he could have done these things within the 3+ decades of time he had just leaves questions as to why he didn't. Before we move on to the next part of the con's plan, we also have to address Jerry Wang, who was established to be responsible for NASA's mapping satellites being sabotaged so that they wouldn't spot the Ark. While the film doesn't go into much specifics on how long he's done this to appease the Decepticons, it should be safe to infer that he sabotaged the lunar orbiter that launched back in 2009, as well as the one from 1994. Possibly. Now, in regards to the first of the orbiters that launched in the mid-60s that were sent to map out the moon's surface for the Apollo mission, we'll have to also infer that the US government at the time kept a close watch on the moon's mapping and did some meddling themselves, or had some NASA personnel do it for them and be tight-lipped about it. I wish some of these details were cleared up a bit more or made more specific without the need for inference, but considering the timeline of events, how the film illustrates the government's capability of covering up Apollo 11's secret agenda, and what we understand of Deep Wang from the screen time we get of him, there's still just enough here for the dots to connect fairly sufficiently. So there's that out of the way. The next part of the plan is when the army of Decepticons hiding on the moon comes into play. This army was responsible for the hundreds of pillars being hidden across the moon's surface so that it can eventually be transported to Earth by Sentinel. They all hide within the moon's surface, just lying in waiting for several decades before the day comes for when the space bridge is activated by Sentinel. These cons, each carrying a pillar, go on to spread out across the globe in order to facilitate Cybertron's arrival to Earth's orbit. This does beg the question of how these Decepticons were able to go into stasis without any worries of needing to be powered back up by either a surplus of energon or the Matrix like what Sentinel needed, where they're all just put into sleep mode and then the space bridge was like some alarm clock that goes off when it's time for the cons to all wake up and do their thing. Would have been nice if we got something to answer that question. Now, while that's one thing worth noting, there's another prominent criticism that's levied towards this film in terms of the Decepticons' plan to bring Cybertron to Earth via the space bridge, and to enslave humanity into restoring it. The question goes like this: why wasn't this the plan from the very beginning?
And if this was a plan that has been in the making for decades, why was this not the first plan?
Now, I understand why this sentiment seems to persist, because it seems like the most logical plan for the cons to commit to, and the first two films seem to be a bit redundant. However, what would you guys say if I told you that I do have an answer for why the space bridge plan was saved for Dark of the Moon through an in-universe context? The answer is easy, actually. Easy as 1, 2, 3. I suppose some elaboration is in order here, so let's get right into that. The first film establishes that Megatron and the Decepticons want the Allspark, the item of great cosmic power capable of creating Cybertronian life forms, in order to increase their numbers, overwhelm humanity and the Autobots, and conquer the universe. Then the second film establishes that the Allspark holds information on where the Matrix of leadership is hidden. Since the Allspark created the Cybertronian race, which included the original Primes, whom we see in the second film, it's implied that the Allspark also played a crucial role in creating the Matrix by extension. Despite being used as a power source for the Sun Harvesters to produce energon for the destruction of suns, Revenge of the Fallen also has it to where the Matrix can also resuscitate Cybertronians. Since a fragment of the Allspark alone is enough to do such a thing like what happens with Megatron and Jetfire, it should be safe to conclude that the Matrix has the power to do the same, like when we see Sam resurrect Optimus at the end of Revenge of the Fallen, and when we see Optimus reawaken Sentinel in Dark of the Moon. Now, I understand that Revenge of the Fallen is a bit of a clown movie in terms of just having things happen and be established to be the case just to move the plot along as the result of a writer's strike from back in the day. But we have to take both the first and second films into consideration as canon in order to see how Dark of the Moon's writing stacks up. Like I said earlier, and I'm sure many of you folks out there, do wish that Revenge of the Fallen had the stronger writing necessary to make the mechanics of the Matrix, among other things, tighter and more coherent in the bigger picture of the Bayverse, but alas, here we are. Anyways, moving right along and to actually bring us into Dark of the Moon, Megatron and Sentinel both planned to meet at Earth, since the Allspark was there, only to have misfortunes come their way with Megatron freezing in the Arctic and remaining in cryostasis, which does beg the question of how Sector 7 was able to get him in the Allspark to the Hoover Dam to be kept hidden for several decades despite not having the means to keep him in cryostasis in their early days, but I digress. While Sentinel was forced to go into a comatose state on the way to Earth after the Ark went adrift. Dark of the Moon pretty much establishes that the Decepticons' plan always was to bring Cybertron to Earth in order to restore it, since the latter currently houses both the Allspark and potential slave labor. But it was delayed due to fate having other plans, as Megatron himself would put it. Megatron isn't brought out of cryostasis until present-day events in 07, and even the Allspark was destroyed by Sam once he shoved it into Megatron's chest to kill him, leaving only a couple of shards left to retain info on the Matrix's whereabouts. Once Sam inadvertently gets that info into his brain after discovering one of the shards, the Decepticons, mainly Soundwave, set the priorities to get the other shard, which was held by Nest after Optimus retrieved it from Megatron's remains in order to resurrect their leader. After finding out that Sam has the info in his head, with the Fallen stating that such knowledge found in the Allspark can never be destroyed, but rather it can only transform, the Decepticons then go in pursuit of it in order to find the Matrix so that the Fallen can activate the Sun Harvester, which is hidden in the pyramids of Giza. Since they need energon to support and sustain their forces, the Decepticons need that knowledge in order to acquire the Matrix. Now, of course, we know that the cons were thwarted anyways, with the Matrix now in Optimus's possession and the Fallen having, well, fallen. So Megatron and his followers have to go into hiding, regroup, and come up with a workaround in order to set their plan involving Sentinel and his pillars into motion. Which then brings us to the cons using the Ark's fuel cell to lure the Autobots into a trap to reawaken Sentinel and to kick their master plan off. So to put things simply, without the Allspark, the Matrix remains hidden. Without either the Matrix or the Allspark, Sentinel remains in stasis. Without Sentinel, the Decepticons can't use the pillars. Without the pillars, the Decepticons can't bring Cybertron to Earth to restore it. Had everything gone without a hitch, the Decepticons would have been able to get the Allspark and expand their forces as the first step of their plan, then use the Allspark to uncover the Matrix and use it for the Sun Harvester to create Energon to sustain themselves for their conquest, and, with Sentinel on their side, they would bring Cybertron to Earth as part of their end goal. Now, this does beg the question of whether or not the Fallen would have welcomed having Sentinel collaborating with his apprentice, and if Megatron had it in mind to potentially overthrow the Fallen with Sentinel's help. That, and there's also the fact that Megatron didn't even know that the location of the Matrix could be transferred from the Allspark to Sam's mind, considering that he was under the impression that all was lost when it was destroyed in the first film, and the Fallen had to tell him otherwise. I won't pretend that some parts of the Decepticons' plans throughout the trilogy don't have issues, but when taken into account all three parts of the Decepticons' grand scheme throughout this trilogy, it all still seems to track reasonably well when you break down what the cons are looking to achieve. The main issue is that there are points throughout this trilogy where it doesn't quite come together as cohesively as it should have. Maybe if there was a plan laid out for how Michael Bay, the writers, etc. would like to see the Bayverse go after the 2007 film, then that would be swell. We could have had some seeds or even whispers of Decepticon collaborators in the US government, or even just have it just be chalked up as rumors, or a hint at the Seekers and the hunt for the Matrix in the first film without outright stating them, since we still want to stay focused on the Allspark being the main MacGuffin. In fact, while we're at it, we should also take into account the footage of the Mars rover getting destroyed by a Decepticon in the first movie. Footage that Sector 7 has and even shows the Secretary of Defense John Keller. This footage was what convinces Keller to call off the US Navy potentially engaging with other countries and to find out about Sector 7 as well as the rather small, minor, maybe not all that important detail of aliens existing and invading Earth. If Sector 7 was able to acquire this footage from Mars, and considering they've been around since the days of Herbert Hoover, hence the Hoover Dam being built to conceal and do research on the Allspark and Megatron, then surely Sector 7 would be interested in the space race and what could come out of it. Granted, S7 was given directors-only clearance on the Apollo 11 discovery, as stated by Charlotte Mearing, but the fact that someone as obsessed with Cybertronian history on Earth as Seymour Simmons wouldn't have had this information on hand before Sam could get it from Deep Wang is kind of odd. So what I would elect to do is to just streamline the space exploration stuff in the first movie to suggest that the space race was also tied in with Transformers and that Simmons is aware that something relates to it but has had no luck in getting any deeper intel on it due to how close to the chest the US government is keeping it. Basically, we tighten up the backstory of the Cybertronian race being on Earth for many, many years, and we also have it to where Megatron was always intending to betray the Fallen at some point with Sentinel's help, as well as have it where Soundwave was given orders directly from Megatron to collect intel wherever he can, but mainly to set up a network of human collaborators on Earth, including Dylan Gold and his father, and to make any knowledge of his presence as tightly knit as possible with some help from Ravage and Laserbeak, to avoid any potential for exposure, and to only get himself directly involved beyond the spy network in case Megatron dies, so that he can find a way to resurrect him. Now sure, this doesn't fix all the issues throughout the trilogy, and this is certainly not addressing what Age of Extinction and The Last Knight bring to the table, because that's a whole can of Leviathan-sized worms that I am not going to think about opening here. This is all mainly to tighten up the continuity and to have it be more thought out than what we got. But that just about does it for this section, since ultimately the Decepticons' plan in Dark of the Moon is downright awesome in concept, and it definitely plays into how they're using deception and underhanded tactics in order to facilitate their end goal. However, it's far from being immune to scrutiny, and a lot of it has to do with how some extra thought should have been put into how things line up with the rest of the trilogy. The next topic worth discussing should be in regards to certain key characters in the film, and the best one to start with would be our protagonist, Sam Witwicky. Transformers Dark of the Moon is meant to be seen as a culmination of Sam's progression, both in his journey as a hero and in his love life. The hero aspect was done fairly well. The romantic side of things, though, that's where we kind of start to see some problems, but let's hold off on that for a bit. As we see in Dark of the Moon, Sam isn't doing too well when it comes to striking out on his own. While he does have a girlfriend with a high-paying position to where they're able to live in a very nice, luxurious apartment in Washington, D.C., Sam is struggling to find a job, and that gets to him because, as he puts it, he wants to do something that matters. Given what we saw of his journey in the first two films, Sam essentially was thrusted into a situation that he was fated to partake in due to him initially unknowingly holding the key to Earth's survival. After saving the world in 2007, he tried to move on and lead a normal life for himself, but he wasn't allowed that luxury when the Decepticons, whom he previously thwarted, sought after him again. He then goes through the ringer, even dying for a brief period in order to save the world again and resurrect Optimus. So by the time we get to Dark of the Moon, Sam has saved the world twice, to the point where he was even awarded a medal from President Obama. However, he's also forced by the order of the U.S. government to be tight-lipped about the specifics in his deeds and must resort to trying to lead a normal life. Something which he thought he could get before he found himself being hunted by the Decepticons in the second film. At this point, Sam feels like a normal life isn't what's best for him anymore, that he should be fighting alongside the Autobots, so that he could get a sense of fulfillment knowing that he's making a difference. A lot of this frustration comes from the fact that he's struggling to even find a job to help financially support Carly, despite everything he's done. In fact, one of his attempts to acquire a position fails due to him mentioning that he got a medal from Obama despite what he went through to earn it, which he's legally unable to disclose. This frustration comes to a head when Sam is offered a lower position in Acaretta by Bruce than what he hoped for, where he tries to say that he's done things that matter, things of which he is not allowed to disclose the details, things that saved Bruce's life, whether he realizes it or not. He still gets the job and settles for it, accepting the position he's at, only to see that Carly not only has history with her boss, Dylan Gold, but also gets a really fancy, expensive car lent to her from him, which he points out could get them a house if they just sold it. Regardless, Sam tries to press onward. However, Jerry Lang, who's been watching him throughout the day, forces Sam into a moment of privacy to disclose information regarding an ongoing Decepticon conspiracy. After Wang literally goes out the window, courtesy of Laserbeak, Sam finds himself with a target on his back once again, and what was meant to be his first day at his new job, a fairly normal day, becomes the beginning of a new mission. So Sam immediately springs into action and brings Carly with him, to keep her safe of course, so that he can try to disclose his newly acquired intel to Nest and the Autobots. After some antics with Nest guards who nearly detain him, he and Carly are still able to get in thanks to Bumblebee's intervention, his first car, whom he hasn't seen for a while. He expresses his frustration to Bee about his absence and having to work with a crappy car that can't even start properly, despite his understanding of Bee being a busy bot. And this is all still pretty understandable given the day he's had and how he's just been thrusted back into a conflict that he was about to reconcile with not being a part of anymore.
He berates him because now he has to drive an unattractive car. Fuck you, Sam.
Or Sam's just an a-hole, I guess. Look, I said that I was done devoting a whole section of this video on Bobsheaux's video. I never said I was done referencing that catastrophe of a video full stop, but I somewhat mildly digress. Despite being able to get the intel to his allies via mirroring and allowed to even witness Sentinel's revival, he's still deemed by her as nothing more than a messenger, and his heroics, which she does acknowledge with some reverence, are downplayed because of his position as nothing more than a civilian who just so happened to have had a part to play in world-changing events, sent off with nothing more than Bumblebee to accompany him as witness protection. This prompts Sam to seek Seymour Simmons' help in uncovering the Moon Conspiracy, which leads them into finding the cosmonauts in Washington. However, upon her discovery of what he's doing, Carly becomes fed up with Sam, thinking he has to put his life on the line in order to matter when he matters to her. This is a conversation where both sides bring up valid points. Carly doesn't want to potentially lose Sam just as she did another loved one of hers, just so he could feel like he matters when him mattering to her should be more than enough, while Sam states that he has to matter now because the Decepticons came back out of hiding years after their defeat in the second film, and that's just too big of a deal for him to ignore. It isn't just Sam being mean to his girlfriend like some folks out there would claim is the case.
If by this you mean being a monumental prick to your girlfriend who's head over heels in love with you, yeah, I'm pretty sure you can handle this.
Are you sure about that?
Anyways, moving on from there. After declining to come with her to a company gathering at Dylan's place, Sam's relationship with Carly falls into question to the point of a potential breakup being just over the horizon, reinforcing how his need to matter is putting a wedge between him and those he cares about. After the Moon conspiracy is fully uncovered, and especially after witnessing Sentinel's betrayal, Sam falls into a state of desperation to find Carly, since everything's become clear that he needs to protect the people he cares about the most, even telling his parents to leave Washington for their safety, which is well informed by how his parents were used as hostages by the Decepticons back in the second film. Does this still sound like an a-hole to you, Bob? Anyway, after reuniting with Carly, he makes it very clear to Dylan that he wants nothing from him and that he just wants to be with his girlfriend. And then, things take an even darker turn when Dylan's allegiance to the Decepticons is revealed, and Carly, the woman who matters to Sam now more than ever, just as he mattered to her before, becomes a bargaining chip for Dylan to force Sam into being a puppet temporarily. Sam, seeing that Dylan is secretly a traitor to humanity and being forced to betray his Autobot friends in order to save Carly, vows to kill him one day. Then Sam, being forced by the Watchbot into getting the intel, still tries to find a way out by kind of spazzing out within Miri's presence, but to no avail. Then the announcement of the Autobots' exile is made, and from Sam's POV, things have just gone from really bad to even worse than that. During his final exchange with Optimus and eventually Bumblebee, Sam, at the behest of the Watchbot, finally asks Optimus if there's a plan for them to come back and save humanity like they always do. And he even says that no other human needs to know because they can trust him. At this point, Sam asking this isn't even to appease Dylan's demands, but because he needs a reason to hope. He needs some reassurance that humanity can still be saved. Then Optimus says that there is no plan, which is mainly his way to keep secret the Autobots' plan to hide in a section of the Xanthium that would separate upon the ship's launch. However, as far as Sam knows, this is a soul-crushing revelation that humanity is now on its own and has already lost. As the old saying goes, evil flourishes when good men do nothing. In fact, even within this scene, Simmons utters a line that evokes that message. Years from now, they're gonna ask us, where were you when they took over the planet? We're gonna say, we just stood by and watched. This line from Simmons suggests that humanity in the present allowed its fear and desperation to subvert its faith and to shape its destiny, robbing itself of any chance of a better tomorrow. Then the Autobots are seemingly shot down, and Sam, believing that his friends are all gone and that Dylan and the Decepticons committed one final betrayal, one more twist of the knife, so to speak, has only one prerogative left. Go to Chicago and rescue Carly or die trying, even willing to go into the city by himself when Epps and his team start to reconsider upon arrival. Then hope is restored when Optimus and the Autobots arrive shortly afterward to help Sam in rescuing Carly and winning the war. After many trials and tribulations, including but not limited to surviving Shockwave's driller, killing Starscream where he tells Carly to hide so that he can allow the Khan to focus on him, and witness the near execution of Bumblebee, Sam finally reaches the control pillar to help the Autobots in destroying it. This culminates in Sam fighting Dylan, who is able to reactivate the pillar and continue Cybertron's teleportation process. Sam is then able to gain the upper hand, willingly declares himself as not a hero, but just the messenger before killing Dylan. With the war finally won, Sam embraces Carly, making a promise that he will do anything for her to make up for all that has transpired. Despite having gone through hell and back, despite not having a job at Acaretta anymore, and despite no longer having a war to partake in, he now sees that Carly is the most important thing that matters to him. And that's enough. So overall, Sam actually has a pretty strong storyline in this film that is not only well informed by his experiences in the prior entries, but it also brings his journey towards a solid conclusion where the character ends up in a pretty good place to where he can depart from the franchise on a high note. That is, as long as we ignore the last night, making a sudden reference to how he seemingly died off screen at some point in time after the events of Dark of the Moon. So anyways, Sam's story ended pretty well in Dark of the Moon, just so we're clear, and it's the only ending that should be indisputably counted. Now, as far as Carly is concerned, she's an interesting case. Carly Spencer is Sam's girlfriend in Dark of the Moon, whom he met back in the White House when she was working for the Embassy of the United Kingdom. Carly is picking up the slack for Sam while he's job hunting, and she's more than able to do that thanks to her high-paying position in Dylan Gold's company, whom she's had a history with before meeting Sam. Carly even gets a Mercedes-Benz, which is secretly Soundwave doing undercover work, lent to her from Dylan, and this, along with the fact that she has her position due to her relations with her boss, causes more of a rift between her and Sam. This tension between the two comes to a head when Carly sees Sam, along with Simmons and Dutch, doing their research on the Moon conspiracy in her apartment, causing her to be fed up with it. An argument ensues as Carly tries to get Sam to not go through with partaking in the Transformer conflict again, just so he could matter again. She had a brother who was killed in combat, and considering that she would know what Sam went through, since she often refers to him as a hero, the fact that Sam came back from the clutches of death during the second film would only be understood by anyone aside from him as a miracle. So Carly tries to appeal to not only the fact that she loves and matters to him, but also the fact that if something were to happen to Sam this time, he won't be coming back. After Sam makes his refusal to go with her to Dylan's party clear, Carly then leaves him with his lucky rabbit's foot, which was mainly from a rabbit plushie that she gifted to him earlier in the film, with the relationship in a dire place. Once Sam meets back with her, and despite her willingly leave Dylan's party due to her boss tipping off his involvement with the cons, Carly is then abducted by Soundwave and Dylan, who use her as leverage to force Sam into getting them intel on the Autobots' next course of action. From then on, Carly is pretty much what one would call a damsel in distress, who also witnesses against her will the atrocities committed by the Decepticons in Chicago, as well as a falling out between Megatron and Sentinel, which will become relevant later. Shortly afterwards, Carly is then rescued by Sam and Bumblebee and provides intel to Nest on where Sentinel has the control pillar set up so that our heroes can destroy it. She then accompanies Sam as well as Epps' team for a period of time in order to get to their final destination in the city, while surviving several perilous scenarios. From some Decepticons, including Shockwave and his driller, attacking them in the skyscraper, to an encounter with Starscream, etc., etc. Then, after Sam makes his final push to the control pillar, Carly takes it upon herself to help in potentially turning the tide even more in the Autobots' favor by leveraging Megatron's humiliation from earlier into getting him to kill Sentinel. This goes on to make Carly the indirect yet very crucial cause of Optimus' life being narrowly saved at the end. One neat detail about Carly is how, despite being on the Autobots' side at the end of the day, she still employs a tactic that one would expect from a Decepticon, which is to coerce or even somewhat manipulate her enemy into costing their own faction a victory. In this case, she convinces Megatron to go after Sentinel instead of staying in a slump, which would have cost the former his title of commander, but it would have resulted in Optimus' death due to his inaction. Finally, after the battle is won and the war is essentially over, Carly and Sam reunite and she vows to hold him to his promise to make up to her for everything no matter what. Despite Bumblebee rushing into proposing that she and Sam get married, Carly happily views that idea in a light of consideration, as she says that she loves this car with earnestness. So basically what we have here isn't bad, and it makes Carly a pretty functional love interest for Sam, except when you start to remember Michaela Baines, which this film acknowledges once and dismisses her completely, with Wheelie and Brains talking about how she dumped him between movies, and that she was mean. This right here is the most significant writing blunder that this film commits, more so than anything in the plot or world building. Yes, even bigger than the Soviets, somehow getting the fuel cell. Thanks to these two lines at the start of Dark of the Moon from Wheelie and Brains, Michaela is thoroughly character assassinated, which hurts even more because regardless of what one may say about Megan Fox's acting in the first two films, Michaela was actually not that badly written. She's not a complex character by any stretch, in fact, one could argue that she's kind of thin, but the blooming romance between Michaela and Sam was a big part of the first film's story, and that romance gets further developed in the second. Sam was willing to lay down his life to stop Megatron from getting the Allspark in the first film. No sacrifice, no victory, and all that. Because the fate of the world and humanity was all on the line. And Michaela, the girl whom he liked in school and who's been a witness of the Transformers war alongside him, is a part of that world, thus giving him more than enough motivation to help the Autobots, and that's not including his moral obligation in case of happenstance due to his great-grandfather's glasses holding the Allspark's coordinates. But before we even get to that, Sam finds out that his high school crush, the girl whom guys like Trent like having around as a sort of trophy, had a juvie record, as in she served time as a minor as a result of her being brought along by her father for when he was stealing cars at the time before they both got caught, thus altering Sam's understanding of the girl of his dreams. He finds out about this when Simmons mentions about her father's parole coming up. Yet despite his initial shock from that revelation, Sam still asks for Michaela's juvie record to be expunged once their business with Sector 7 was done. In fact, over the course of the first two films, Sam didn't just risk his life for the sake of saving the girl who was pretty much the love of his life. He straight up dies for a short period in the second film because of his devotion to saving that girl, among other things. And it was Sam dying and coming back to life that prompted both him and Michaela into professing their love for each other respectively. Needless to say, Michaela has been through a lot with Sam in the first two films, discovering an alien race, fighting alongside a faction of said aliens against another, being on the run as wanted fugitives, and undergoing several near-death experiences. So it's gonna be more than a huge pill to swallow when we have to now accept that after all they've been through, Michaela just dumps Sam off screen, and he just so happens to find himself another spicy hot girlfriend named Carly, whom he met at the White House upon receiving a medal from the president for his heroics back in Egypt. I get that the reason for why Carly ended up replacing Michaela falls more onto the meta than anything. Megan Fox was fired due to the drama she had with Michael Bay at the time, and I get that Rosie Huntington-Whiteley, who was a Victoria's Secret model before signing on to play Carly, probably wasn't expected to somehow be able to just play Michaela due to how A, she bears no resemblance to Megan Fox whatsoever, and B, it's unlikely for her to have been able to hide her British accent and try to sound like an American. However, Aaron Kruger was given the task to try to find a way to justify how or why Michaela would no longer be a part of Sam's life, despite how crucial her role would be in this film. Carly landing a really good, high-paying position at an investment company to where she lends Sam lunch money because he's struggling to find a job after having prospects like graduating from a prestigious university, having a less troubling upbringing, and even getting a medal from the president, would have been more meaningful as a juxtaposition if it was Michaela, who would have had to have worked hard and in less glamorous jobs in order to eventually hit it big. So when Dylan steps in and tries to swoon Michaela, in this hypothetical of course, it makes us want to root for Sam even more to win her back and strengthen their love for one another. And by having Michaela be the girlfriend in this film, it adds even more to the stakes for Sam to try and save her from Dylan when she's eventually kidnapped. Again, I understand that there was an uphill battle in trying to justify Michaela not being around anymore, as a result of some behind-the-scenes drama that was beyond the writer's control. But to have it where the film paints Michaela in a negative light, despite everything we were shown not informing these attributes being stapled onto her, just leaves somewhat of a bitter taste in one's mouth. And again, all this behind-the-scenes drama having such an impact on the writing, especially for this film to be the culmination of Sam's love life throughout the trilogy, is a real shame because what we have here with Carly, despite the meta, does work fairly well as is. It's not complex, nor is it perfect, but she does serve her purpose well in the story, which bolsters Sam's story in the grand scheme of things. It's just that, had it been Michaela instead, and perhaps with a couple of very small tweaks, it certainly would have been stronger. By this point, we've spent a whole lot of time going over the plot and the more significant parts of Darkened Moon's human element. So now, why don't we go over a bit on the characterization of the Transformers themselves, or at least the more substantial components in the Transformer cast as a whole, shall we? First, let's talk about Sentinel Prime, our primary antagonist. So Sentinel was hinted at in a scene from Revenge of the Fallen during Sam's little brain-tism during his astronomy class thanks to the Allspark shard he discovered earlier. He brings up the Sentinel Prime expedition that had disappeared for, according to the dialogue, 14 galactic convergences before anyone got an echo. This is a neat tidbit of world building that one could easily miss, which left a little breadcrumb going towards the possibility of Sentinel appearing in a later story, which Darkened Moon would go on to follow up on. The concept of a Prime falling from grace and even becoming a villain is quite fascinating. It adds a bit of tragedy to how even the Cybertronians that are meant to represent the best of their species in terms of virtue could fall. The issue with the Bayverse's handling of this concept, though, is that Revenge of the Fallen fumbled the ball, but not giving the Fallen any sort of nuanced characterization beyond him just wanting to use the Sun Harvester and hating humans, seeing the code that him and his former brothers were meant to abide by as a weakness that keeps them from just harvesting energon without a care for any moral implications that would arise. Basically, the Fallen was just a generic one-dimensional villain who had a cool backdrop and potential to be much more. The fact that Revenge of the Fallen didn't even make the relationship between Megatron and the Fallen any more complicated than just a master-apprentice dynamic akin to Darth Vader and Palpatine, but without much of a hint at all of the two secretly wanting to kill each other, is a waste of potential that's just borderline criminal. But to bring us back to Sentinel, the aforementioned idea of a Fallen Prime was not only utilized for him in Darkened Moon, but it was also done better by actually giving Sentinel an extra layer of complexity to why he does what he does. Seeing no other way to save Cybertron and win the war against the Decepticons, Sentinel allowed himself to essentially make a deal with the devil by switching sides and concoct a plan with Megatron to restore Cybertron. He's also characterized as being prideful of his stature as a Cybertronian, let alone a Prime, and considers it to be a weakness for his kind to be merely tenants of Earth. One such example is when he demands that the pillars are to be returned to him, only to be denied by Charlotte Meering, when she states that even powerful beings like Cybertronians can't just bring resources, troops, or weapons to Earth's atmosphere without some checks and balances. This gets to Sentinel, and it comes full circle during his betrayal, when he declares himself as a Prime and that he doesn't take orders from Meering or any human for that matter. This sort of behavior also comes up when Sentinel asserts to Megatron that he'll never work for him as a way to quell any potential for the latter to seize an opportunity for power over the former. Later on, when Optimus confronts him, Sentinel remains steadfast in his belief that they were once gods in their heyday, and they're now treated by humanity as nothing more than machines, as lesser beings. And now, Sentinel and the Decepticons intend to take that perceived godhood back, contradicting the principles of being a Prime that he was meant to uphold by being instrumental to Chicago's decimation, plans to enslave humanity and strip the Earth of its resources to rebuild Cybertron, and even willing to have his former Autobot brethren killed. But once he's beaten down by the likes of Megatron, and once he's at Optimus' mercy, Sentinel pleads for his life and tries to get him to understand that he had to commit to betraying the Autobots and allowing humanity to die so that the Cybertronian race could survive. Which, of course, doesn't go unpunished. There are points where we get subtle hints to how a part of Sentinel doesn't want to betray his fellow Autobots, especially his own successor, due to his history with them while remaining committed to what he believes he must do and deems betraying them as a necessary evil, such as when he declines Optimus' proposal to lead the Autobots again, and later when Sentinel only spares Optimus during their first confrontation, making it clear that he won't hold back next time, as reinforced by what we see later. Now, for as much as people harp on Sentinel quoting Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, where he tells the Autobots that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, primarily because the film had the late great Leonard Nimoy say it for the sake of a reference, the context still works in this case. From this perspective, the use of the word need is from the POV of Sentinel Prime, who believes that what is objectively a want is actually a need in his eyes. basically twisting the meaning of the word to justify his actions. The Decepticons represent the many who seek to restore Cybertron and return to their former glory, regardless of what it would mean for Earth and its people, while the Autobots represent the few who are fighting to save Earth even if it's at the cost of Cybertron. There's also some neat bit of irony that we get during Sentinel's battle with Optimus, where he chides him for never making the hard decisions, which, in this case, would be to allow for Cybertron's restoration at any cost. He calls Optimus out for being unwilling to make the tough calls despite his immense bravery as a Prime, which would enable him to do so. The irony stems from how Sentinel is refusing to make what would make the hardest decision for himself, to accept Earth as his new home and coexist with the human race instead of deeming them both as beneath him. To accept that Cybertron is not a place, but a people, one may say. Now, to backtrack to the conversation between Optimus and Sentinel earlier in the film, we have a line from Sentinel that turns out to be quite ironic once we have the whole picture. In this scene, he tells Optimus to never mourn the past in response to the latter lamenting about what might have been if his mentor was the one to lead the Autobots' final stand on Cybertron in his stead. While Sentinel's words to Optimus may still be seen as those of comfort, there are two factors to consider which shine a much sinister light with context that we get later in the film. First, Sentinel is saying that past transgressions on Cybertron won't matter because there is the promise of a new golden age for it through Earth's enslavement, which Optimus unknowingly and unintentionally played a part in. And second, upon retrospect, Sentinel's words in this scene make him a hypocrite due to how he tells Optimus not to mourn the past events on Cybertron, which resulted in its desolation, when he himself will commit to monstrous actions later in the story as a result of his refusal to let go of the past, and letting said refusal shape him into a shadow of his former self. All this goes to show how one scene, even as short as this, can establish so much about a character and have such meaning that the story not only capitalizes on over time, but will recontextualize in a way that makes said character all the more fascinating when taken as a whole. And that's why I agree with Alistair Haken when he says that Darkened Moon doesn't get enough credit for its writing, because despite its flaws, there is still clearly effort put into the script that actually pays off pretty well, the stuff with Sentinel included, which is more than I can say for most blockbuster-type films that we get nowadays, I tell y'all what. So overall, Sentinel Prime stands as the best villain in the Bayverse, due to the surprising amount of complexity that he has as a character with a layer of tragedy to how he betrayed not just the Autobots, but everything he once stood for as a Prime. For our second exhibit, it makes sense for us to follow Sentinel up with a little assessment on Optimus Prime. Now, there's going to be a whole section on a certain moment involving Optimus, which we will get into soon enough, but for now, let's just go over how the character is handled, generally speaking. I'm gonna have to save that last bit involving Optimus for a whole section, and you will all find out what it is and why soon enough. Anyways, moving right along, Optimus Prime kind of sits in between how he was portrayed in the first two films, where he's shown to be a firm but caring leader who will absolutely kill when he has to in order to save the world and people that he's come to call his home and allies. Upon finding the Ark's fuel cell in Chernobyl, Optimus expresses frustration towards how there was still some secrets that humanity has yet to procure to the Autobots, and this gets a much-needed clarity when the space race is revealed to be a way to uncover the Ark. Optimus shows reverence for Sentinel, who led a desperate mission to escape Cybertron with technology that would have turned the tide of the war, and has a highly vested interest in getting his old leader and that tech before the Decepticons do, not knowing that the Cons already got it and that it was part of Sentinel's plan in collaboration with them all along, making this a strong case of what we tend to call dramatic irony. After bringing Sentinel back, Optimus shows him their new home and even offers him the Matrix of Leadership to lead the Autobots as he did in the past, only for Sentinel to decline that proposal. Then, after Sentinel murders Ironhide, attacks Nest, and steals back his pillars, Optimus sees in horror the aftermath of what has transpired, with Mirroring exclaiming that it was his fault. In this case, Optimus understands that she was right, because he was the one who brought Sentinel to Earth, and despite not knowing his true intentions, set his former mentor's plan fully into motion. Optimus tries to stop Sentinel and reason with him once the latter brings the Decepticon invasion force to Earth, but to no avail with the realization that the mentor whom he once knew was gone, vowing that the matter between them isn't over. From then on, even upon the Autobots being exiled, Optimus does everything in his power, even secretly setting up a backup plan for the Autobots to fake their exile/death to make up for his dire mistake. After the Decepticons take over Chicago, Optimus and the Autobots arrive to set things right in a Hail Mary against the cons. The lengthy Battle of Chicago ensues, with Optimus saving Sam, Carly, and Epps' team from the Driller, only for Shockwave to retaliate and temporarily take him out of commission, and him needing the Wreckers to help him out of a bind, and then he goes on to slay Shockwave along with a bunch of Decepticons all at once, so that he could use Shockwave's cannon to disable the control pillar. Then we have the big fight between Optimus and Sentinel, Prime versus Prime, the salvation of Earth versus the salvation of Cybertron. Despite Sentinel condemning him for choosing humanity over Cybertron, Optimus remains steadfast as he always does, and calls his former mentor out for being the one who betrayed the very foundation of being a Prime as he was taught, that freedom is the right of all sentient beings. During their fight, Optimus loses an arm and is crippled to where he is helpless to defend himself, begging for Sentinel to spare him in a final act to reason with him. It was only through Megatron's sudden intervention that Optimus' life is saved, giving him the chance to finally end the war. More details on this particular bit coming very soon, I promise you all. I do wish that Optimus' closing speech lasted just a bit longer and not have ended so abruptly just so the film could cut to credits right afterwards. We don't even get an "I am Optimus Prime," ... at the end like we did in the first two films or the two after Dark of the Moon. So this just kinda sticks out a bit. Perhaps they could have had Optimus say something along the lines of, "I am Optimus Prime, and I send this message to say that the war is over, and that Earth, our home, can finally know peace." Just figured I'd share that thought for you folks. Ultimately, Optimus Prime is pretty well realized and remains fairly consistent with what we've seen of him throughout this trilogy, save for some weak lines of dialogue here and there, like the occasional instance of "you die" to Shockwave, or "we will kill them all" during the Autobots' arrival in Chicago, which honestly could have been rewritten to him saying nothing to Shockwave when killing him, and for the other scene, something along the lines of "we will make them pay for this," or "they will face justice for this." In fact, Dark of the Moon provides more to chew on in terms of drama for Optimus to go through than anything that we got in the prior film, such as the fact that he was tricked by his old mentor whom he thought he could trust, and that resulted in devastation which he would fight tooth and nail to ensure the Decepticons would face justice for. Not to mention, he also gets some of his most badass moments in this film, not just during certain moments of action, but especially when it comes to how he solidifies himself as a hero who will fight for what's right no matter how dark the hour is, such as when he declares that, in the name of freedom, the Autobots would take the battle to the Decepticons, which they go on to do, and then some. So, in closing, Optimus Prime, pretty good, I gotta say. Now for our third exhibit, let's get right into Megatron. While his screen time is limited in this film, at least in comparison to what he had in Revenge of the Fallen, Megatron does have a fair bit going on, both behind the scenes and otherwise. That being said, due to having such minimal characterization over the course of the original trilogy, Megatron was still kinda wasted upon retrospect. The first film did a good job in establishing him as a serious threat that once he reawakens and is freed from his icy prison, our heroes have every reason to fear him and want to keep the Allspark as far away from him as possible. Since the first film was sort of testing the waters, they didn't want to go too crazy or complex or even overly ambitious with Megatron in terms of characterization, aside from a seed of backstory as supported by Optimus' referral to him as a brother during his death. Yet they were still able to nail the essentials of making him an effective villain. Then we get to Revenge of the Fallen, where he was resurrected and it's revealed that he's a disciple for the Fallen. And this is where the wasting of potential comes in. If there was more of a complicated relationship between the two, akin to, again, what we would see from a couple of Sith Lords from Star Wars who secretly plot to kill one another to ensure a more permanent seat in power, or if we even got some insight on why Megatron became the Fallen's disciple, as well as some history on how Megatron fell from grace, and how his relationship with Optimus went up in flames, then we would be onto something. But alas, Revenge of the Fallen never elaborates on any of that, and so we're left with a one-note villain serving under another one-note villain. So now, we come to Dark of the Moon, and we do have a little more going on with Megatron character-wise, but still not that much when it's all said and done. After his crippling defeat at the hands of Optimus in the prior film, Megatron is basically a broken husk of the mighty leader that he once was, continuously licking his wounds while still trying to maintain his status as a domineering commander of the Decepticons. This time, he's sitting back and letting his followers do the work for him to enact their plan, involving Sentinel and the Pillars, until he's able to make his way from Africa all the way to the United States. Somehow. Without any energon detectors or long-range defenses to worry about, like I mentioned earlier. So for the most part, during the second half of the film, Megatron is just working with Sentinel and setting up Chicago as their base of operations for the final step in the Space Bridge plan. He proclaims how he promised this victory to Sentinel, where they would rebuild Cybertron together. However, Sentinel, distrusting of that last part, begins to supplant Megatron by making it clear that he would never work for him, when he only agreed to work with him. This exchange is witnessed by Carly from afar, who would use it to facilitate a later event. Then once the Autobots storm Chicago, and after a warning from Dylan, who was somehow able to get all the way from his condo, from his basically from his penthouse, from high up in that tower that he was in, all the way down to ground level within a minute. But after all that, Megatron then gives the order to the Decepticons to hunt down the Autobots in the city, and after that, he just disappears for the majority of the Battle of Chicago, and we don't see him again until Carly finds him sitting around in an alleyway, and just watching as Cybertron is teleported into orbit. He watches it with a shred of satisfaction, knowing that everything that he's done up to this point is now finally paying off, with Cybertron's salvation just over the horizon, literally, despite being in a slump, while Carly knows that his humiliation at the hands of Sentinel is the reason why he's there. Hence what happens next. Carly then goads him into going after Sentinel by stating how the Decepticons will rule Earth with Sentinel in charge, because Megatron, as she puts it, will be nothing but Sentinel's bitch. Of course, this angers Megatron deeply to where he starts to lunge at Carly, but upon stopping himself for a moment with the realization that she would be correct, and knowing that a Decepticon victory on this day could mean that he would be redundant in the Khans' hierarchy, it motivates him into trying to take back his leadership to assert dominance over Sentinel, which not only costs Sentinel his victory over Optimus, but it also costs them both their lives after Optimus is able to recover, despite Megatron's proposal for a truce. Again, more on this scene later. Megatron's story in Dark of the Moon, as thin as it is, deals with him losing his leadership status as a result of his past failures, and it culminates in him to go into a mad dash to get his ironclad will and power back, only for that to cost him his victory and his life. Had we been given just a bit more to flesh Megatron out, not just in this film, but also in prior films, especially in Revenge of the Fallen, this honestly could have been a pretty neat conclusion to Megatron's story, where power corrupts him, and that need to keep it becomes his undoing, as well as the undoing of the other leaders with whom he was aligned. Ultimately, though, Bayverse Megatron is pretty thin in terms of characterization, which would be fine if we were just going off of the first film. However, that thin characterization persists throughout the original trilogy, as well as beyond, and even the tidbits of depth and intrigue that we get from him in this isn't enough to make up for what is lacking. Next up, for our fourth exhibit, let's discuss Laserbeak, who, despite being a minion of Soundwave's, is fairly prominent in this film. Laserbeak is shown to be an extension of Soundwave in terms of infiltrating human facilities and spying on certain key targets. Megatron goes on to give the order to kill most of their human collaborators, thus Laserbeak goes on to enact those killings. There's a great creepy vibe to how merciless he is, with implications that not only will he kill the collaborators in cold blood, but any witnesses, which may even include family, i.e. the wife and child of one collaborator that we see during a montage. Laserbeak also takes pleasure in striking fear and suffering on the others, even someone like Jerry Wang, whom he considered as his favorite, before killing him in a way that makes it look more like self-deletion than murder. Afterwards, he tries to attack Sam at Acaretta, only to be unsuccessful, thus prompting the human to become an active participant in the plot going forward. For the rest of the film, though, Laserbeak primarily pops up on occasion to menace Sam and even tries to kill him during his attempt to rescue Carly, only to be dispatched by Bumblebee via a commandeered Decepticon gunship. This would lend some credence to why Soundwave would go on to try to avenge his minions by singling out and executing Bumblebee later in the film, since B killed not just Laserbeak, but also Ravage back in Revenge of the Fallen. Laserbeak stands as a pretty solid villain who gives characters like Sam something to deal with on a human-sized scale, and also adds to the menace of the Decepticons in terms of their tactics and espionage and assassination. Save for the question of how he got into Acaretta without energon detectors to account for, I genuinely can't see how anyone could look at this murder bird and not find him to be such a neat addition to the Bayformer cast.
Laserbeak has more dialogue than Soundwave. He was completely mute in the cartoon, and now he has more dialogue than Soundwave.
Oh, right, he's not cartoon accurate, right. As if that's somehow a metric on whether or not he's a good character in his own right. In fact, I'll just go ahead and say it as someone who has watched the G1 cartoon, the Bayverse did Laserbeak better. Because unlike the G1 version, which was basically one of Soundwave's pets with no lines whatsoever, that kind of served as nothing more than a drone, we get an actual character with a discernible personality, effective dialogue, and meaningful interactions with his human co-stars. Just because a movie or a show was the first of a certain franchise, that doesn't automatically make it the best, or that there's no need to improve upon it whatsoever. Have you guys guessed yet that I kinda hate Bob's video here?
Disgusting.
Anyways, moving along. Going into our fifth exhibit, this will be a bit unexpected for some of you folks here, I'm sure, since this character isn't even in the film all that much. And yet, there's still a fair amount for me to say about this one. So this character, whom I shall devote this exhibit to, is none other than Shockwave. Despite not being in the majority of the film, the last third makes up for it where Shockwave ends up being a sort of mini-boss throughout the battle in Chicago. Not only does he have his driller, which our heroes have to contend with, but he's shown to be incredibly resilient even when he's overwhelmed by enemy fire, to the point where his eye starts dangling from his head, yet he still gets back into the fight to defend Sentinel's pillars. It's not until Optimus Prime comes in before a finishing blow is actually dealt onto the one-eyed Con. On top of that, Shockwave is partially what sets the rest of the film in motion, where the Autobots would likely not have taken the bait had the Con and his driller not put up a good appearance that they wanted the fuel cell that they themselves used as bait anyways. Had he not put up a good appearance, the Autobots would have been pretty suspicious about why Shockwave made it look so easy for the fuel cell to be taken back, thus decreasing the chances of the Decepticons' plan working out as well as intended. If you ask me, it's not about how much screen time one has, it's how they use it. And Shockwave's limited screen time was used pretty effectively. As far as the other Cybertronians go, there isn't too much to say at all, though the recurring ones are still pretty consistent and have some neat stuff going on with some of them. Bumblebee is still the loyal friend of Sam, who can be goofy at times, but can be a badass warrior to protect his friends as well as avenge the ones he lost. Starscream is still the slimy and opportunistic second commander of the Decepticons, who teases and even feigns sympathy for Megatron during his weakened state, who would go on to get a set piece of his own. More on that later. Soundwave getting more of a prominent role in this film than what he got in Revenge of the Fallen, with Laserbeak as an extension of him, is a nice touch, even if some details involving his place in the plot, especially in the wider context of the original trilogy, could use some improvement. And then there's Ironhide, who gets some standout moments as a badass, such as during his confrontation with the Dreads, who will even disturb an angry Optimus to get out of his truck mode and actually talk with Charlotte Meering during an earlier scene, only to be suddenly and brutally murdered by Sentinel, giving us a valid reason to want to see Sentinel face justice. I will admit, though, it would have been nice if perhaps Optimus and some other Autobots like Ratchet or Sideswipe had a moment right before going out and start battling Decepticons in Chicago, where they directly state that they will do it for Ironhide, to honor and avenge their fallen comrade. It honestly would have taken the filmmakers just a moment of time to illustrate it, so I can't see why we couldn't have had that. But alas, we go onward. Also, hi Barricade. Haven't seen you since you disappeared suddenly back in 07. With Nest gunning you down, maybe now we can assess that you die by the end of this film. Oh, never mind. Seriously, not that the fault lies on Darker Moon for this, but how the hell did Barricade survive losing his foot and apparently getting swarmed by Nest troops, clearly indicating that he wouldn't walk out of there alive, even with the camera cutting away before we see him properly dying, so that he could suddenly show up A-OK, alive and well, years later in The Last Night. It's just kind of fascinating is all, but let's carry on from there. Now in terms of Wheelie and Brains, the comedic Transformers, even they aren't without some merit or neat stuff going on with them. Wheelie remains ride or die for Sam and the Autobots, to where he not only tries to warn that the Autobots' exile is all part of a Decepticon trap, which would make sense for him to say so because he was a con himself in the prior film before he switched sides, but he, along with Brains, was willing to potentially die if it meant saving his friends from getting executed, while Brains, despite being a bit of a creeper at the beginning of the film admittedly, carries over some of Wheelie's characteristics while also being a tech-savvy little bot, which he puts into good use as we see during Sam and Simmons' research on the Moon Conspiracy, and when he sabotages the Decepticon ship to save their friends down below. Overall, while I'll agree that a bit more characterization with these Cybertronians over the course of the original trilogy would be preferred, with a notable exception or two, what we get from these bots and cons is still sufficient, and even, in some cases, pretty good. Alright, so now we come to this section, which will now bring us to what is often described as the most controversial aspect of this film. Optimus executing Megatron and Sentinel Prime at the end. I've elected to save this part for this section in terms of discussing the storytelling and character writing, and that's because I have a lot to say about it to the point where this one scene requires a whole section to discuss it. So let's get right into it. After the Autobots destroy the control pillar, halting Cybertron's teleportation process and causing it to warp in on itself, Megatron calls for a truce because all he wants is to be leader of the Decepticons again. He even poses a question to Optimus on who he would be without him, and Optimus then responds by saying, "Time to find out," where he goes on to attack Megatron and quickly kill him, tearing his head off along with his spine in tow. Megatron even tries to shoot Optimus but wasn't quick enough on the draw. Right afterwards, Sentinel pleads to Optimus by trying to get him to understand why he had to betray him, which is to ensure the survival of the Cybertronian race, only for Optimus to cock Megatron's gun and state that Sentinel betrayed himself, his principles as a Prime, before executing him. So yeah, Optimus dealt quite the harsh punishment towards both Megatron and Sentinel Prime, and this is seen as out of character for him to do so, to where people have gone on to argue that Optimus is a war criminal, hence the controversy. Now here's my rather hot take on this. Optimus Prime did nothing wrong here, and you all can fight me on this. As we see in the Bayverse, the Decepticons are depicted as cold-blooded, genocidal monsters with seemingly no qualms of killing whole scores of beings that they deem as inferior to them. Just because media like Generation 1 doesn't show Megatron and his goons committing mass murder since it was a cartoon for kids intended to sell toys, that does not mean the Bayverse should be condemned for showing what the endpoint of the Decepticons conquering Earth and exploiting its resources would actually entail. And let's not forget, while Megatron was the leader of the Decepticons, Sentinel was not only a willing collaborator, and not only did he make himself known as a rogue Autobot, now serving as a representative of the cons to the UN, but after the Autobots are thought to be dead, he was the one who gave the go-ahead for the Decepticons to seal Chicago off, which included the total annihilation of the city's inhabitants. As Soundwave states, even in regards to the Autobots, whom he and his comrades have at their mercy, or lack thereof, no prisoners, only trophies. We even hear the likes of Barricade laughing after executing Q. And guess what? Before that happened, Sentinel saw that the bots whom he was a leader of and possible role model for were set up in a firing line and seemed totally fine with letting them die for standing against what he felt was best for Cybertron. Not only that, but need I remind you that Sentinel's first action of betrayal before taking back his pillars from Nest was gunning down Ironhide, one of Optimus's closest Autobot comrades, and leaving him to slowly and painfully die and turn into a pile of rust. Even after Ironhide's death, and after the activation of the space bridge in Washington, D.C., which let a swarm of Decepticons out onto Earth to wreak havoc, Optimus tries to reason with Sentinel and tell him that working with Megatron to restore Cybertron was not the only way for their people to live on, that coexisting with and defending mankind is the right way. However, Sentinel makes it clear that because mankind views the Cybertronians as mere machines when they were once gods back in the good old days, coexistence is not an option, that humanity must either serve their new masters or die. He even makes it clear to Optimus that he would have killed him if it meant ensuring that his endgame would come to fruition. Sentinel fell from grace back on Cybertron when he made his deal with Megatron to save their planet by exploiting the Earth and its people, even when it would only lead to their destruction, thus breaking the most important rule of a Prime, a rule which was broken before by the Fallen, something which Optimus would have more than enough awareness of by this point in the series. Optimus's trust in Sentinel was betrayed, and by extension, humanity's trust in the Autobots was betrayed, which resulted in their initial exile, thus allowing for the Khans to fully enact their plan without anyone to challenge them. But even after all that, after trying and failing to reason with him initially back in Washington, even after the deaths of not just some of his fellow Autobots, but also the tens and thousands of humans in Chicago, Optimus still begged for mercy in an attempt to get through to Sentinel in a final desperate effort for him to turn back on his misdeeds. However, Sentinel is still shown to be more than willing to execute Optimus himself in cold blood, after having incapacitated him to such a significant degree, a far greater degree arguably than even what Megatron does to Sentinel shortly afterwards. Optimus executing Sentinel by this point would be justified because the same measure of mercy was granted to the latter as what he granted to the former. None. And Megatron's execution can be described as not just retribution for leading the war that overwhelmed and ravaged Cybertron in the first place, indicating his hypocrisy for wanting to restore the planet when he genocided many Cybertronians who defied him, thus making him the main instrument of Cybertron's desolation in the first place, and for leading several campaigns on Earth at this point which would have resulted in mankind's doom if left unchallenged. But also, Optimus understands that if he were to let Megatron walk away this time, the cycle of destruction on a potentially similar scale as what we've seen up to now would just continue, and Optimus would still be responsible for letting it happen. Also, have I mentioned yet that Optimus was the one who brought Sentinel to Earth in the first place? I feel like I have, but I kind of want to just, reiterate it here, just in case it isn't clear enough. He already had the responsibility of undoing the damage which he unknowingly and unintentionally caused. If anything, it would be unethical for Optimus to entertain any other option than to deliver brutal but necessary justice to individuals who had an intent to commit such horrific acts. And so the cycle had to be discontinued so that all the war and bloodshed would finally end. After committing these executions, Optimus goes on to look around at the results and throws down Megatron's gun, which he used to kill Sentinel because he understood that it had to be done no matter how much it would hurt him deep down, no matter how much it would even disgust him in a way. He never reveled in doing this, or in any of the killings he does prior to this moment, because it was all necessary in stopping these genocidal monsters from destroying Earth and enslaving humanity. And that's the brutal truth of it all. War is hell. And this one moment with Optimus, without a single line of dialogue, conveys that notion quite well. But this was a hell that Optimus needed to overcome in order to save the world, which he and his fellow Autobots have come to call home. So no, Optimus was not in the wrong for executing Megatron and Sentinel by the end. Even if the Autobots were to take them as prisoners, the world would absolutely call for their execution after committing a multitude of atrocities and nearly destroying the world. Multiple times, even in Megatron's case. Based on what we see in this film, as well as what we see prior, what Optimus did here wasn't a war crime, it was justice. No more and no less. Much like the first two films, Transformers Dark of the Moon has its share of comedy, though it's mainly front-loaded in the first half of the film this time, with some sprinklings here and there in the second. Some of it lands, I would argue, and some of it, well, not so much. Some parts work pretty well, like when Bruce, Sam's soon-to-be boss at Acaretta, gets deeply offended by the sight of a red cup on an office floor that's meant to be yellow-coated, which then pays off by Carly gifting Sam with a red cup and Twizzlers on that same floor right in front of Bruce, leaving the guys in the room in a state of awkwardness. We also get a funny moment where Sam freaks out after getting flung out by Bumblebee to invade an intense car crash caused by the Dreads, and put back into his car mode. In fact, I'll even say Sam's freak out at Ness was pretty funny after his car gets pinged by energon detectors due to Wheelie and Brain sitting in the back. Though it's mainly due to Shia LaBeouf just going all in this moment is informed by him just desperately trying to get a hold of the Autobots, but to no avail. Unfortunately, we get some bits of comedy that go just a little too far. Like when Judy Witwicky, Sam's mother, goes on to talk about the size of her son's junk, let's just say. Well, Sam just sort of like cuts her off, or at least talks over her before we even hear too many of the details of that. And she talks about how insecure he is, despite always getting the hottest chicks. Yeah, we really didn't need that, despite how it is consistent with her not having much of a filter at all as a character, especially when it's followed by what is meant to be a tender moment about how Ron, Sam's father, was willing to do anything to keep Judy, and that Sam should do the same for Carly. We also have a scene where Sam undergoes a slapstick moment due to the Watchbot that Dylan forced upon him to get info on the Autobots and what they were currently planning. While I personally only find the scene to be amusing rather than outright funny, let's just say that upon my recent rewatch of the film, as well as thanks to Alistair Haken for making a point on it during his Darker Moon video, which I didn't even consider, there's actually a pretty neat detail about why Sam is being so erratic during this scene. He's trying desperately to find a way out of getting the intel from the Autobots that Dylan and the Decepticons want, even telling Miri that he posts blogs online and doesn't know when to shut up, even to no avail. Yet another example of how much of a good, principled protagonist he is, despite some folks finding him to be annoying, which is subjective and not a strong enough point against the film's writing quality at all. All that being said, this scene is the last instance where the film throws in comedy of that kind, at least for a while, because afterwards, the film doesn't go out of its way to undercut how dire things get by the last third of the film. Once the Autobots are seemingly killed off during their mass exodus and the Decepticons begin their hostile takeover of Chicago, and the few bits of comedy that does come in, mainly from Wheelie and Brains as well as the one guy in Epps' team during the climax of the film, is intermittent and does land because it's not compromising the tension of our heroes trudging through a war-torn city that's crawling with bad guys. However, even with some hit-or-miss comedy from the likes of Jerry Wang and Bruce, though the former being on edge from Laserbeak stalking him does justify his off-kilter behavior, and the latter does have his share of amusing moments, which mainly come down to John Malkovich delivering them pretty well, we have Seymour Simmons returning, and accompanied this time by his assistant Dutch. And these two are just such a treasure to watch. Their camaraderie and interplay is so entertaining, thanks to John Turturro clocking in and putting in the work as always, and Alan Tudyk bringing a whole new layer of eccentricity right down to hinting at how much of a badass he is, which contrasts hilariously with how flamboyant he is, such as when he apologizes for starting a brief fight in a Russian club, stating that it was the old version of him that he was trying to move away from being. We even get some amusing banter between Simmons and Charlotte Meering, which establishes some history of a kind they've had with one another, which gets called back to in an amusing mid-credit scene where Simmons kisses her in celebration of the war being won, and Meering having him arrested for it. Albeit jokingly so. Maybe. So yeah, Simmons and Dutch get a big old thumbs up for me. There are a couple of minor things though. First, it is kind of a shame that Michael Bay couldn't just do another take to hide the obvious stunt double for Dutch during his fight sequence at the club. Like, the double looks nothing like Alan Tudyk, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Secondly, there's a point in the film where we see Dutch wearing a neck brace as if he was supposed to have sustained an injury earlier in the film. The problem, though, is that we never see him experience anything that could result in that. Not even during the highway sequence, because it's not the dreads that made Dutch crash Simmons' car. He just pumped the brakes on the car right after Simmons got flung out of it by Crowbar. Then the next time we see them, Simmons is in his wheelchair, which makes sense because he sustained a serious injury, while Dutch has the neck brace. And then later on in the film, which would be the following day in universe, we see Dutch without the neck brace full stop. So, did Dutch sustain some weird injury off screen that somehow healed up a day later to where he didn't need a neck brace anymore? Was there a deleted scene that was meant to explain the neck brace? Or did Alan Tudyk experience an injury in real life and the filmmakers never bothered to account for it? It's such a strange thing that I've noticed for years and couldn't quite wrap my head around on. But now that I see it, and now that I just start thinking about it more, well, yeah, why does he have that? It makes me wonder if there was an alternate version of the Dread sequence where Dutch actually did crash the car and he did sustain that neck injury. But then it just makes me wonder, why did they cut that? I'm just confused as all. So overall, the comedy in Dark of the Moon doesn't always work, but when it lands quite well, actually, especially in comparison to what we had previously. Now, the last thing in regards to Dark of the Moon's writing that I want to cover is what one could describe as its thematic elements. Man, oh man, I can only imagine the looks on some of you folks' faces right now. Now, a response that I'm very certain would come up the most expectedly is something along the lines of, "But see, Monster, Michael Bay's Transformers films have no thematic elements or depth to their storytelling whatsoever. They're all just a collection of explosions and boobs loosely strung together by a script made from slop. How could you say that there's anything to glean from such dreck?" Well, good sir, or ma'am, allow me to lay it all out for you. One of the more common themes in Transformers Dark of the Moon, that are more intrinsic to the film specifically, deals with abandonment. Sam forsakes his relationship with Carly in order to make himself matter after his heroics seem to be glossed over by the world around him, only to lose sight of the fact that he matters very much to his girlfriend. While he doesn't realize it at first, Sam's drive to uncover the Decepticons' secret intentions and his jealousy towards Dylan drives a wedge between him and Carly and their relationship. So when things take a turn for the worse, Sam endeavors to save Carly and to never allow such forsaking of her to happen again, even if he is to die trying. This is an example regarding abandonment where a character eventually redeems it. But how about some examples of characters who had forsaken something and choose not to take the path of undoing the act? Sentinel forsakes his Autobot brethren and his principles as a Prime in a desperate ploy to save Cybertron at the cost of Earth and its people. As a result, he ends up witnessing those plans being thwarted, and he pays for his crimes. Dylan Gold forsakes humanity, not just the human race as a collective, but the humanity within himself, by remaining in allegiance to the Decepticons. Much like Sentinel, Dylan also pays for aligning himself with what he thought would be the winning side, only for that side to be the one to lose in the end. Though unlike Sentinel, who's more dominant to where he basically takes command over the Decepticons away from Megatron to make a point that he'd never work for him, Dylan remains submissive to his clients out of self-preservation, even in the face of humanity's enslavement. And while Sam is always on good terms with the Autobots, even being good friends with Bumblebee, and finds himself counting on them to save the day, Dylan is always on edge with the Decepticons, including Soundwave, to where during the Chicago invasion, he tells Carly that they said he's safe from their genocidal antics, while pacing back and forth in a state of unease, because he knows that they could just as easily change their minds and kill him, should they deem his usefulness to be expired. There's also some neat parallels amongst the character dynamics in the film, even with some of the warts in the plot kept in mind. Sam loves Carly and she loves him for the hero that he is, while Dylan desires her despite her objections towards him due to him being a turncoat. Optimus stays true to his principles as a Prime to fight for humanity and to protect it from the consequences of the Cybertronian War, while Sentinel's willing to go the extra lengths to sacrifice the Earth and its people in order to save his own planet and people. Even Bumblebee and Soundwave are a neat parallel, where Bee is a loyal Autobot scout who is ride or die for Sam due to their bond that they've had since the '07 film, while Soundwave is a Decepticon spy whose relations with Dylan is nothing more than an alliance of convenience, since the latter values his own self-preservation enough to go along with what the former demands from him. Dylan even has to convince Soundwave to lay off on Carly, not for Sam's sake, but for his own. However, due to his loyalty to the Decepticon cause, Dylan's words hold just enough sway to convince Soundwave to start executing their Autobot prisoners, because he knows that, if there aren't any witnesses to his treachery in case the cons are defeated, Dylan would be tried for war crimes, especially in light of how complicit he was in Chicago's devastation, thanks to Sam relaying some intel to Simmons, who then relays it to Meering and the rest. There's even some neat details in the film that foreshadow Sentinel's betrayal, or provide some irony. During the scene where Optimus and Sentinel have their exchange in an open field, there's a thunderstorm in the background, foreshadowing the fact that both mentor and pupil will battle each other, and the inevitability of the storm of war approaching, and coming to a head later in the film. As far as certain bits of irony are concerned, we have Richard Nixon's phone call to Armstrong and Aldrin during the moon landing, where he says, and I quote, "Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. It inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth." The irony of these quotes in the context of Dark of the Moon is how the moon landing was secretly spurred on by the discovery of alien life from the heavens themselves, with Earth also becoming a part of the aliens' world as a result of them arriving on it, and on its moon, long before Apollo 11 was even conceived of. Despite the moon landing itself being a historic event for mankind, even that would be eclipsed in the eyes of Armstrong and Aldrin by them uncovering the Ark, which resides on the moon's surface for reasons totally unbeknownst to them. Even more palpable as an example of irony is how certain members in both the US and Soviet space programs were secretly working for the Decepticons to eventually bring about the end to humanity, and the Ark's landing on the moon was one part of a large-scale war where humanity would find itself caught in a crossfire. So much for peace and tranquility, am I right? So overall, from a thematic standpoint, and how such thematic elements come into play, as well as how they're supported by the present storytelling, one could say that there's more to Transformers Dark of the Moon than meets the eye. Get it? Did you guys get it? You guys see what I did there? I did the thing. Okay, I'll stop now. By this point, we've talked a lot, and I mean a lot, about the plot, characters, world building, thematic elements, basically the writing in general in Dark of the Moon. But now let's talk about how the film is done from a technical standpoint, from how the visual effects, especially for the Transformers themselves, are done, to the action sequences, which the big robots partake in most, if not all of, to even the designs of the robots and how they come together overall. There are some tisms in some of the action scenes, which will be worth highlighting, don't get me wrong, but it's safe to say that there's going to be a lot of praise in this section. Not that I haven't given some praise or laid out some defenses in certain other aspects of the film, but still. The blending of practical effects, stunt work, and CGI is second to none in this film, and is something that has been sorely lacking in a lot of blockbusters we get nowadays. Some such examples that hold up on that level, as well as maintain tension, intensity, excitement, etc., primarily come from the Battle of Chicago in the last third of the movie, though there's still such examples in earlier parts as well. For instance, anytime Shockwave and his driller appear, the stakes ramp up due to the overwhelming chaos caused by the driller during the sequence in Chernobyl, and especially when it starts tearing through the skyscraper to kill Sam and company. Seeing all the behind the scenes of how Michael Bay and his crew were able to put together the setting of a building that's leaning and on the verge of tilting down due to its structural integrity being severely compromised, through a practical set and some well-polished green screen, lends to the tension of our heroes always being in constant danger of falling to their deaths while trying to evade some Decepticons. So with the driller being such a dangerous threat that overwhelms even the Autobots to the point where they have to retreat into a nearby building in order to plan a diversion, it eventually leads into such a satisfying crescendo where Optimus, after successfully acquiring his flight tech, arrives at the collapsing building to dispatch the driller and save his human allies. Another example of a great set piece is the one where Lennox and his Nest team have to fly into Chicago via their wingsuits, which is shown to be quite difficult and resulting in them sustaining significant casualties due to the large presence of Decepticon fighters as well as Starscream. The involvement of both stunning CGI and stunt work, featuring stuntmen actually skydiving from around a tower, as well as the adrenaline rush of seeing a bunch of brave soldiers trying to narrowly evade enemy fighters across Chicago's skyline, all come together to make for one exciting sequence. Now, of course, there's also some great fight sequences between the Transformers themselves with solid choreography, whether it's Bumblebee using his speed and the surprise factor involving falling debris, thanks to Wheelie and Brain sabotaging a Decepticon ship, in order to get the upper hand on a bigger and stronger Soundwave, or Optimus and Sentinel having an intense sword fight where the latter is clearly shown to be stronger than the former, to where he's even able to simultaneously take on multiple Autobots at one point, culminating in Sentinel nearly killing Optimus with Megatron's sudden intervention stopping him at the last second. After Revenge of the Fallen had somewhat sapped the tension of seeing our protagonists being in danger of dying, Dark of the Moon was able to bring that tension back, after having seen the death of a prominent Autobot like Ironhide, as well as with the stakes being the highest that we've seen the trilogy get up to this point. And this allows for the set pieces in Dark of the Moon to have that much more of an impact due to the sense of finality where even beloved fan favorites like Bumblebee could wind up dead by the end of the film, thus making the sight of them being able to bounce back and win the day all the more satisfying. And these sequences are complemented beautifully by Steve Jablonsky's score. In fact, the score for Dark of the Moon is arguably the best in the whole series. It gets across the epic scale of the Autobots making their last and most daring push against the Decepticons, as well as how dire and potentially world-ending the situation is, with the Decepticons becoming a looming, overwhelming threat. We get tracks like It's Our Fight, The World Needs You Now, and renditions of Battle played during various action sequences in the film, that the music really adds that extra punch to what are already some adrenaline-pumping, technically proficient, and just straight-up kick-ass set pieces and moments. There's also the new theme for Sentinel Prime, getting across the juxtaposition of an old Autobot leader and mentor figure of Optimus who has gone rogue, the theme for Shockwave, which conveys the overwhelming menace of a new, deadly Decepticon who displays greater resilience and power than most of his comrades, especially with his driller as an extension of his will, and with the music packing a lot of bass. And we even have the film carry over a track from the second film's score, titled Heed Our Warning, which never even made it to that film, but it finally gets its moment to shine in this film, when the Decepticons start taking over Chicago. I can't help but think that the track was initially meant for when the Fallen started making his move in the second film, but having it for the invasion of Chicago is honestly even more fitting, since I kind of consider Heed Our Warning to be the Bayverse Decepticons anthem, even if it does sound a bit like a variation of Ennio Morricone's opening track for John Carpenter's The Thing, especially for how it begins. Still sounds creepy and awesome though, and to hammer the point further in that Dark of the Moon's soundtrack is great and is implemented very well, we also have Linkin Park's Iridescent, which we hear a motif from a couple times throughout the film. But, aside from the closing credits, the most notable use of the song is when Sam and Epps gather up some of the latter's old Nest buddies and arrive in Chicago, getting across how hopeless the situation seems to be. Yet they move forward into the city's ruins for the sole mission of finding Carly and getting some payback against Dylan for his role in the Decepticons campaign. As far as the motif goes, we hear it during Sam and Carly's argument, emphasizing the low point in their relationship, during the pep talk that Sam gets from his parents that inspires him to get back to Carly, and when Sam tries to head into Chicago to rescue Carly despite Epps' objections due to it being a suicide mission, with the strong likelihood that she may already be dead. And when the film ends, we hear the rest of Iridescent play during the credits to emphasize the restoration of hope and the promise of a brighter future over the horizon for both mankind and the Autobots, and how despite the hardships, the betrayals, the losses taken, there is a chance for both man and Autobot to rebuild together, and that the day would never come where they'd forsake each other. It's simply beautiful. Too bad the sequels kinda F that over, though. So, needless to say, the action sequences are incredibly well done overall from a technical standpoint, and they lend to the epic scale of the Transformers War on Earth coming to a head, with a great soundtrack to boot that complements other scenes, quieter scenes even, very, very well. That being said, however, there's some tisms in the action scenes that are worth noting. First of all, the highway sequence has the issue of Simmons having a bit of plot armor where he's able to survive being flung from his car by Crowbar and taking a tumble on the concrete road. I get that the film acknowledges this by putting him in a wheelchair for the rest of the runtime, but a man in his 50s taking a tumble on a freeway from a car that's going at 55 miles or even 60 miles per hour after being thrown out of it by a giant robot that was also doing a jump over said car in the process is a bit of a leap, let's just say. It's not like superhumans are a thing in this universe, or, well, at least not intentionally so. Second of all, Dino, despite being an Autobot whose primary concern should be to protect human life, kills Hatchet via decapitation after swinging him into an oncoming civilian vehicle, potentially harming the occupants in that vehicle. I get that the Autobots are trying to stop the Dreads from getting to Sentinel, and they want to do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible, but still, what the hell, my guy? You could have killed someone there. Which then leads up rather nicely into the third issue. The second half of this highway sequence reuses footage from another Michael Bay movie called The Island, where a similar set piece occurs, minus the giant alien robots. The cars flipping and crashing and wrecking are all the same as they appeared in that film, albeit perhaps some different angles of how they're shot, except the CG artist had to superimpose the Autobots and Decepticons in the middle of them. Which does look pretty impressive. They do look pretty well integrated in these scenes, but there is still a larger issue. This is less of an in-universe issue and more of a filmmaking issue, because Michael Bay just decided to pull from the same playbook as the Showa era of Godzilla films, where stock or archive footage from an older film is reused/repurposed into another. While this isn't necessarily new for the Bayverse, such as how we see shots of aircraft carriers and destroyers taken from Armageddon being used for Transformers 07, but that's less egregious and arguably less lazy than a whole section of an action sequence from the island being recycled for Dark of the Moon. I know he only had 2 years after doing the second film to make this one, but Mike, my guy, that is not an excuse for this. Another notable example of tisms during the film's set pieces would be during the sequence involving Sam having an encounter with Starscream. During the set piece, Sam uses a gauntlet given to him by Q that he uses to shoot a grappling hook into Starscream's eye, resulting in the Decepticon commander flailing around in pain and desperately trying to get the hook out. Eventually, the scene goes on to where Sam sticks a boomstick into Starscream's other eye, fully blinding him, and so Sam needs help from Lennox to cut the cord before the boomstick detonates, killing Starscream. It's pretty lucky for Sam and Lennox that Bumblebee just so happened to be nearby to catch them both and save them from falling to their deaths after the latter cuts the cord. However, more notably, the amount of plot armor that Sam has to have in order to survive this ordeal is kinda insane. Not only is it lucky for Sam to have not been swung hard into the side of a building and having his body go splat, but the whiplash from Sam swinging and being thrown around so erratically alone would have cost him his arm and he'd be dead, whether from fall damage or severe blood loss. However, suffice to say, even with those types of goofs in mind, the action sequences, visuals, even the music in Dark of the Moon, save for some parts here and there, are downright awesome and showcase the best that the Bayverse has to offer, especially with how they serve well as part of one hell of an epic finale of the original trilogy of Bay Forward films. Now, as far as robot designs are concerned, we have some familiar designs with some tweaks here and there, like for Ironhide, Bumblebee, and Optimus Prime as a few examples. And we have new designs for certain recurring characters, like Megatron and Soundwave, as well as new character designs for, well, the ones introduced in this film, like Sentinel Prime, the Wreckers, and Shockwave. There are some characters, like Starscream and Wheelie, who pretty much look the same as they did back in Revenge of the Fallen, except Wheelie has his eye fully repaired/healed after it got torched by Michaela previously, so not much to say about them other than that I've always found Starscream's design to get too much flack. I really like how angular it looks as well as how flexible it makes him look. And it lends for a very intimidating appearance, such as when he's menacing Sam and Carly, and I dig that he kept his Cybertronian tattoo art from the previous film, which indicates that he isn't as bothered about concealing himself or his loyalty to the Decepticon cause at this point in the series. So, neat stuff overall. As far as the new designs, they're pretty great. Well, for the most part. Okay, let's address that last bit here. Soundwave's design in this film is pretty solid and does lend for a pretty intimidating Decepticon. I dig the detail where he has speakers on his body and they vibrate whenever he speaks. And while I understand the sentiment behind Soundwave bearing very little resemblance to what we typically see of him design-wise, I'm personally not that bothered by it as long as the character is identifiable in terms of his role in the Decepticon faction, which is that he's above all else a spy, hacker, communications specialist, etc., with loyalty towards the Decepticon cause, especially under Megatron, which both the second film and this film have sufficiently illustrated. However, his face/head looks almost nothing like how he looked in Revenge of the Fallen. The only part of the design that's carried over between the two films is his head crest, but beyond that, Soundwave has more of a mouth with teeth as opposed to a mouthpiece that's akin to what you see from an insect with a slight hint of a mouth guard like what he had in G1. He only has 2 eyes instead of 4, and the back of his head no longer looks like that of a xenomorph, where it's more extended outward. Heck, Soundwave in this film doesn't even have the visor that he had in the previous film. Honestly, they should have just kept the previous head design and it wouldn't be that hard of a sell since he never transformed from a satellite mode in the previous film anyways. So the designers had a blank slate for Soundwave in terms of the rest of his body. If nothing else, I think it would have been cool if he kept his visor and the light from his eyes behind it is so bright that we don't even need to see his eyes. It could make him an inverse of Jazz from the first film, which would be a pretty small but neat little detail. But alas, that is not the case. In all honesty, Soundwave should have just had his Revenge of the Fallen head design carried over into the rest of his Dark of the Moon design. In fact, that's pretty much what we see of him in the Dark of the Moon tie-in game from High Moon Studios, sans the alt mode being different. An SUV in the game and a Mercedes-Benz in the film. Based on that bit of info, one would beg the question if this was the initial plan for Soundwave's design, but then it was changed. Considering that the actors are interacting with or pretending to be seeing giant alien robots rendered in CGI, it's not like they'd interact with such a CG construct any differently if Soundwave's head was carried over from the second film. So there's my stance on Soundwave from a design standpoint. Stocky and intimidating in its own right with some neat details going for him, though I still wish it was more consistent with how he looked previously. Laserbeak does fare better, though, as a murderous Cybertronian bird who serves as an extension of Soundwave, and I dig the fact that he looks like a freaky alien vulture, where his more exaggerated alien-like features are prominently present, more than the fact that he's meant to be a big robotic bird. While giving Laserbeak dialogue is out of the norm for this character in the grand scheme of the broader franchise, the voice acting from Keith Sarabachka gives the Cybertronian murder bird a creepy vibe and the sense that he enjoys menacing his prey before going for the kill. And speaking of alien features, having details like the lower part of his beak splitting when he speaks and retaining the spiny, almost skeletal appearance akin to what his fellow minion Ravage had back in the prior film really helps in translating the Bayverse's design philosophy well in Laserbeak's case. In fact, that's something I've always loved about the Bayverse. The fact that the Transformers themselves are extraterrestrial is first and foremost, and it's been that way since movie 1. From the less humanoid shapes, even amongst the Autobots, to the fact that a good majority of them speak in their native language, these details just ground the Bayformers that much more. Heck, even who speaks the language lends to the characterization for each of the two warring factions, and it makes sense in universe. The Autobots, primarily, if not exclusively, speaking English, among other Earth languages, shows their willingness to come off as friendly and even relatable to their human allies, while the Decepticons, unless in certain circumstances, whether they be private conversation or when speaking with their human collaborators, communicate to each other in Cybertronian so that their intentions wouldn't be easily translatable to humans. Anyway, speaking of alien chit-chattery, Wait, is that a word? Let's move on to a newly introduced character in this film, Shockwave. Unlike Soundwave, Shockwave gets a design that's not only a good amalgamation of his classic look and the design philosophy of a Bayverse Decepticon, but is also just a badass design in his own right. I'll even go as far as to call this my personal favorite version of Shockwave from a design standpoint, if not from a character standpoint. I already went over his characterization in a previous section, so I'll mainly just go over his design here. Shockwave is given a design where he's much beefier than what one would typically expect of the character in the past. However, him retaining his single eye and purple deco, albeit with more scuffs and fading to indicate battle damage, allows him to stand out as a visually striking Decepticon that pays respect to his G1 roots, while also being consistent with the extraterrestrial nature of the Decepticons from a design perspective. And as for Megatron, he's portrayed by having much more of a grungy and battle-worn look, having asymmetrical arms due to him losing one back in Revenge of the Fallen, and part of his head still looking all mangled, which he covers up on occasion with a tarp that works as a hoodie. This makes him look like a disfigured drifter, which is a neat contrast to how he was once the mighty leader of the Decepticons, the doom of all Autobots, the one who single-handedly ravaged Cybertron. Again, how he's able to get around in his vehicle mode that's basically a big old rusty truck with spikes everywhere, like something out of a Mad Max film is anybody's guess, even with him mainly just hiding out in the African safari, but still, a great design for Megatron, especially when it's informed by what he's gone through up to this point. So yeah, there's design choices going on in this film that either tweak what already worked, simply retain what works for consistency's sake, or that are new but also work rather well for the most part. There are still some questionable design choices though, beyond Soundwave's inconsistent head design. The Wreckers having NASCAR fan designs, like Roadbuster having a baseball cap-like headpiece, despite them having British or Scottish accents, is kind of strange. I get that they have NASCAR alt modes with all sorts of badass Cybertronian armor and firearms, so some of these design choices for the robot modes are consistent with that, but even that begs the question of, why even go with that choice in Universe or Beyond, other than just because it looks cool or amusing? Then there's Q, or Wheeljack as Transformer fans often refer to him as, who just looks Oy vey. It's just unnatural. I get that the intent was for Q to be a quirky inventor type, considering that his namesake is a reference to the Q character from the James Bond franchise, who creates cool gadgets, weapons, doodads, etc. for our heroes to use during missions. But the head/face design for Q here is way too humanoid looking for him to fit in well as a Bayverse Autobot. The face designs for the Bayverse Autobots up to this point have always been able to strike a decent balance between them looking alien and approachable, one may say. Even Sentinel Prime, while also having a more humanoid face, is still balanced out by how he's meant to be a more aged Cybertronian due to his facial hair components and other details which make him look not too different from an unmasked Optimus, which adds to the irony in the twist where, despite looking like an Autobot, which he initially started out as, he still aligns himself with the Decepticons due to having changed sides. But then you have Q, who really sticks out design-wise, but in a bad way, to where the human-like features like the eyes, nose, and smooth forehead makes him look less like a Bayverse Cybertronian and more like some weird, uncanny humanoid cyborg. Man, I gotta say, Wheeljack really gets the short end of the stick when it comes to live-action designs, because he gets a good G1-esque design in Bumblebee, which we only get to see for a couple seconds anyway, only for that to not get carried over into Rise of the Beasts, where he gets redesigned into looking like a really strange Steve Urkel-looking freak show. Now, as far as the way Cybertron is portrayed, from a visual standpoint, I absolutely love it. I honestly would even say that it's what I would picture Cybertron to look like in my head when it comes to how to portray it as a world meant to accommodate a race of alien robots. Not just in live action, but even just in any iteration, period. However, I will say that it's not consistent with what we see in the first movie. In 07, we see a slightly less metallic landscape with large metal spires standing and no hexagonal structures covering the skies. One could argue that what we saw in the first movie was somewhere in the outskirts of the planet where Megatron was reigning supreme, while Dark of the Moon showed us an example of what the rest of the planet may look like maybe like a metropolitan area of sorts. But there's nothing in the film or even in the first film to suggest that being the case. It's a pretty minor issue that's balanced out by the stunning presentation that we do see of Cybertron during this film's opening scene, but it is still worth noting. So, Dark of the Moon has a lot of great character designs befitting not only for the Bayverse, but also for the Transformer franchise as a whole. There are some design choices that are pretty questionable in terms of why the designers or whoever went with them in the first place, and there are some which, despite being neat on their own, contradict what we've seen in the prior films. But the rest range from consistent with what we've already seen, but with some tweaks so as to make them distinct enough for this film, to brand spanking new for the overall franchise and leave an impact in the best ways imaginable. And with that, I think it's safe to say that we've covered all the ground that needs to be covered in terms of how well Transformers Dark of the Moon stacks up overall, which means the time for a conclusion on it has come at long last. Boy howdy, what a long man this turned out to be. Granted, chunks of this video were dedicated to responding to some really poor arguments against the film, so that certainly inflated the runtime. Tip off! But let's not inflate it any more than I already have, and just get into my concluding statement here. Needless to say, Transformers Dark of the Moon is a film with great ideas that are realized in its case better and in a more congruent and coherent manner than any of its fellow Bayformers sequels. Yet those ideas still needed some ironing out through a couple redrafts or even a good script doctor in order for their potential to be fully realized. And there were still some missteps that could have just been averted altogether when we get right down to it. I understand that following up on the first two films with this, especially Revenge of the Fallen, wasn't the easiest of tasks, and I certainly don't envy the filmmakers for trying to mitigate the loss of Megan Fox and its ramifications on parts of the writing. But there's still room for improvement that could have been capitalized on. The storytelling is far from flawless, that's for sure, but it's still got more merit than a lot of people are willing to lend it, especially when it comes to some of its character work and even some parts of the plot, and hopefully I've been able to help shed some light on that merit, especially my efforts to respond to some common yet very weak critiques. Not to mention, as a fan of the Bayverse, I still love it, not just for the aspects in the writing that it gets right, but also for how much of a technical marvel it is, almost from top to finish, and the sheer epic scale of the conflict between the Autobots and the Decepticons basically coming to its crescendo is a cinematic sight to behold with an installment that showcases the natural conclusion to what the first film established from a tonal standpoint. Dark of the Moon definitely sits somewhere in the middle of the Transformers film franchise in terms of ranking its writing quality, albeit still leaning slightly more towards the positive. There's enough that hold the script back from being great or even that good objectively speaking, but the things that the film gets right are done so quite surprisingly right. So while it's not as solid from a writing standpoint as the '07 film or Bumblebee, and it's certainly not in the same league as Transformers 1, which is still objectively the best Transformers film ever made, I would still consider Dark of the Moon to be not just the best of the Bayformers sequels, as well as one of the better live-action entries, even if there's not much of a contest there, but it easily would have served pretty well as a satisfying conclusion to the Bayverse. And frankly, based on what came afterwards, it should have been. And so that just about does it for this epic of an essay video of mine on Transformers Dark of the Moon. I would like to thank you all very, very much for watching, especially if you've stuck with me to the end of this video, and I truly appreciate the love and support from those following me here. If this long man of a vid fancied you, I recommend checking out some of my other content, both past and yet to come, whether it would be other essay vids or my live streams. I tend to signpost what I have next on the docket fairly frequently, either on posts here or on my other social media platforms, or during live streams that I either host or guest appear on. So feel free to follow me here for those kinds of updates on any near future projects of mine. But until next time, once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all later. Till all are one. I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.